coming up on 4 minutes past, and I think that's a good window. So it's more than 3 and less than 5. So I think it's a good time to get started. So I want to welcome everybody. It's Phil Decter in Boston, and this is the continuing series being organized by the Bay and Central Academies, supporting your efforts as trainers, coaches, leaders in counties around safety organized practice. And today we're actually going to take a small skip. We had looked at modules 1 and 2 so far, and I'll talk about this in a minute, but we're going to skip Module 3 and we're going to take a look at Module 4 today, and in a couple of minutes I'll talk about why we chose to do that, and hope that's going to work for you today. Here's our agenda as it stands right now. I want to check in with you all if this works for you, if there's anything you'd want to add. But we will kind of do some introductions so everybody knows who's on the call and do a quick check-in. We'll review our agreements and plan for today. The agreements are the agreements that we've had on these calls. This is the 4th one, I think. So we'll review our agreements. Want to give an update on recent changes for the on-site plans. Make sure you all get to hear about that. We'll either do that right then or at the end of the module. I'll leave that to Jennifer and Judy. And then we'll spend the vast amount of our time today reviewing Module 4. Both in that kind of quasi, I'll be presenting some of how I would present this, but also, wanting to have some dialogue about your experiences with this, what you've learned while delivering it, what you already knew about this from before. Many of you have a long experience with solution-focused or narratively based questions and interventions, and so look forward to both learning from you as well as sharing kind of what I've learned about this stuff. We'll kind of just check in about next steps, and we'll do a plus delta. How's that agenda look for folks? Can everybody see the agenda? I guess 2 questions. Can everybody see the agenda? And assuming you can, how does that work for all of you? Are there any requests for changes or updates?
I can see the agenda fine.
It looks good.
I can see the agenda. Looks good, Phil.
Okay, sounds great. So let's do a kind of introduction and check-in, and so you can see what I'd love for you to do is if you could say your name and where you are today. One thing you did over the holidays, personal or professional, that you're at least a little proud of. And if there was something you took from the last call into your work, something you used, something you thought about, it would be great to hear about that as well. And, again, just for way of flow, why don't we start south and go north? And so if you are in the southern part of the state or think you might be compared to your peers, why don't you go ahead and we'll work our way up north. So can I get a volunteer to start?
This is Peggy from Lompoc, California. I'm pretty close to being farthest south, I think. Something I did, personal and professional, over the holidays that I'm a little proud of is that we got a family picture of virtually everybody in our large extended family and got them all together for one day during the holidays, which I was very proud of and also very moved by. And I'm going to pass on the second piece.
Okay. Terrific.
I'm Nancy.
Thanks,
Nancy
Peggy.
Token, farther south than Peggy, Santa Barbara, but same county. My accomplishment professionally over the holidays was I get the honor of coordinating our foster kids gift drive in December, which is always a major ordeal. So I did that, and honestly, the last call seems a million years away, so I'm kind of at a loss for that.
Totally understand. Thanks, Nancy. Can I just call out, there's a decent amount of background noise. Again, you folks may know with these webinars, sometimes you don't realize that you're producing background noise or there's background noise in your area without knowing it. So if you can kind of toggle that mute switch, that would be helpful. Really, as always, want this to be a dialogue, but just want to try to make sure people can hear each other. Thanks. Who is next? So kind of going south to north.
Would Santa Clara be next?
I'll chime in then. It's Marianne from Santa Cruz, just below Santa Clara.
There you go.
Hey, Marianne.
Hi. And so I'm trying to pick it up. So our accomplishment over the holidays? And what was the
One thing
second
you did over
Phil?
the holidays. One thing you did over the holidays you feel at least a little proud of, and one thing you took from the last call.
Okay. Okay, so one thing that we spent the holidays at home, which is, we haven't done that in a long time. And we spent the holidays with our soon-to-be 3-year-old former foster child and his mom, who spent the night, and our job was to bring alive all the magic of Santa. So we made reindeer soup, and we poured glitter all over the house, and Santa did indeed come. And making that magic happen for a little kid is something was both wonderful and exciting to be part of. And what I took from the last call is that when it starts at 9 instead of 9:30, I miss it. So I was a half hour late.
Okay.
And
Thanks,
of course, wonderful, fabulous insights from Heather and all the other folks on the call.
Thanks, Marianne. Steve, did you Santa Clara want to chime in? Yeah.
Yeah, Steve Castro with Santa Clara County, and we are continuing to roll out the safety organized practice as part of our CAP practice model. And one thing that I did over the holidays that I'm proud of is I neither requested nor got any presents, which in a Zen world is great because I have no obligations and I have nothing to unwrap, nothing to return. It's a very simple way of celebrating the holidays. I just did it by enjoying the company of people that I really love.
Great to hear. Did you want to say, is there one thing, and it's obviously okay to pass, was there something you took from the last call you'd like to name up?
It's been a while since I've been on one of these calls, so I can't think of anything specific, but I can say that one thing that sticks out of my mind is I'm very much looking forward to our next 3-day practice model with you, as I enjoy them all thoroughly.
Thanks. Thanks, Steve. Other folks near Santa Clara going north, or if you're south of Santa Clara. Yeah, go ahead.
Good morning. It's Stephanie Johnson. I'm in San Jose. And the one thing I did over the holidays was got my apartment out of clutter and cleaned up to start the new year semi-right. So I'm proud of that. And the thing that I took from the last call is I'm just continuing to just learn more and more about safety organized practice, so I got a lot of information from the last call.
Great. Maybe I could interview you another time, Stephanie, about this accomplishment of cleaning up your clutter. It's something I'm not as skilled about, so I could use some help.
No problem.
Thanks.
Hi, it's Marcy.
Okay.
I think I'm next. Who's this?
This is Sharon Smith, but go ahead.
I'm from the Bay Area, Albany, and what I'm the most proud of is just the opposite of Stephanie. I did nothing. I didn't host any family events. I did absolutely nothing, which is wonderful. It's great. Great vacation. Even not even read my email. I would love to say something about Mod 2, but I am with family in the mountains and don't have my notes with me, so I'm going to pass on that question.
That sounds good. Thanks, Margie. Nice to hear your voice.
Thanks.
This is Judy. I'm not too far from the Bay Area Academy. We're just going to travel a little bit south and to the east, so I'm in Manteca, California. As far as what I did over the holidays, for me it was just relaxing and spending time with family and friends, and it was just good. What's bad about that is it's hard to get back into the work mode once again, so that was a little bit of a challenge. So, and I like Margie, I'm going to skip on the third part of that question because I can't even remember if I was on the last call, so my apologies.
It's all right. It's a tough question to ask right over the holidays. I think there's some,
I know.
some
Not a tough
amnesia.
question, it's tough thinking about it.
Yeah. We'll make that last part a voluntary question. Thanks, Judy.
Well, this is
Who's
Andrea. I
around,
think
Judy?
well, I'm wondering if we're now heading back south to Fresno. I think Fresno, we forgot to jump in. But let's see. So this is Andrea. One thing I did over the holidays, you know, I had some good time with my family, and my oldest son volunteered a little bit in a nursing home. And just being with him as he learned to do that. He's 13 and did it on his own, so I think maybe I'm proud of him, not proud of myself. So that was pretty cool. And then one thing I took from the call, yeah, like everybody else, I can't remember the specifics, but I remember walking away from that call feeling a lot of permission about being really flexible with the tools, and pretty encouraged that perfection wasn't sort of the goal, but that really being in tune with families and being flexible with the application of those tools. I think I walked away with that feeling, but I don't have my notes in front of me.
That's great to hear. Thanks, Andrea.
Sure.
While we're in Fresno, are there other folks around Fresno?
Yeah, this is Jean.
Hey, Jean.
Hi. I just spent time with families and friends and relaxing over the holidays. And I really don't remember the last call. Again, I'm kind of trying to just get back to in the mindset of being back to working over the holidays. So.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Okay, well, I'm
Other
from
folks.
South Fresno.
Who's this? Hey,
Pat
Pat.
Smith. I'm in Three Rivers, California. And what I did is over the holidays, I had a very restful time. But the other thing I did was I helped to set up an art gallery. And it was very much fun. So we had to create the space and hang the art, so it was a lot of fun. And it was all done. It was beautiful. So I was really proud of that. And I'm going to pass on the last question as well.
Sounds good. Thanks.
This is Joy Johnson, and where I am today is in Silver Spring, Maryland. I spent Christmas with my daughter and her family, Southern California, and we entertained a little girl who's actually receiving treatment for leukemia, who's only 5 years old. And that was very interesting, and just to see people reach out to a family. And then now I'm with background noise is my 3-month-old grandchild. So I spent New Year's here, and I'm here. I'm going to stick on the last call and go back to mute. Bye.
Well, happy to have you and your 3-month-old grandchild on the call, and it's great to hear her voice, and I feel a little less lonely because there's someone on the East Coast time, so nice to hear your voice. Other folks?
It's Ryan. I'm in Oakland, Ryan Pickrell, and thankful for the holidays. I had some downtime, which is nice, and I didn't take enough of that, so I'm happy to have balance. And I think, yeah, I don't remember the last call either, so I have to pass on that one.
Okay. Thanks, Ryan.
This is Todd. I'm in San Francisco. And one thing I did over the holidays, it sounds like a theme here, I did not have to travel. I got that out of the way in Thanksgiving, so it was nice to be in the Bay Area. And I think much like a couple others, actually did quite a bit of house cleaning, month-end, year-end reports, tax preparation, although it must be the Virgo in me that feels good about that. So the one thing that I took away from the last call is that I had wished that it had happened a couple days prior because I had taught the module actually before we had the conference. So I had a lot of good gems that I'll use next time.
That's good.
Good morning, it's Veronica Piper Jefferson. I am in Fairfield, California. In terms of the holidays, my family convinced us to go to the snow. My kids are truly California kids because I grew up in Chicago and you just didn't go to the snow. You avoided the snow. And so I actually had a good time, and it did bring back some good memories of playing in the snow.
You had a good time?
I did let myself have a good time because yeah. And, you know, it's hard to ever remember what happens on the last call because I'm so entrenched in safety organized practice that I'm talking about it all the time in various places. So I am always getting gems of information from colleagues, and I never know where it comes from. But I do remember it being a good use of my time.
Thanks, Veronica. Glad you had a good time. In Massachusetts and Boston, you don't have a debate, right? It's like Chicago. The snow comes to you whether you want it or not. Anybody else? I think
maybe that's a good segue for me, Jennifer Cannell. I am in Truckee,
hey, Jennifer,
where it is 10 degrees. And yeah, so I spent a fabulous holiday with my family, very unplugged and nestled into our home. And it was nice playing board games and card games and just spending time together. And I am looking forward to everyone returning to school on Monday. And I was not on the last call, unfortunately, but I'm looking forward to this one.
Great. Thanks, Jennifer. Anybody else that hasn't checked in and introduced themselves? Okay. So I'll just say real quick, so this is Phil and I'm in Boston, and one thing I did over the holidays that I was a little bit proud of was an intervention. We always have dinner on New Year's Eve, my wife, my son, and I, with some dear cousins and my sister's family. And my cousins have become vegan. My sister's family are big meat eaters, and the last couple of New Year's Eves there have been some discord over the dividing of the check, you know, when one group has just had some vegetarian appetizers and one group has had some steak. And, you know, one year one group was unhappy with how we did it, one year another group was unhappy with how we did it. And so this year we just did 3 different checks, and while it was awkward, everyone was happy at the end of the evening. So I was pleased with my stick-to-itiveness because I almost let go of it, and I was like, no, I will not repeat the last 2 years. So that's my lesson for New Year's, is sometimes it's okay to have separate checks. I hope people find benefit in taking the time. I think it's good for folks to know who's on the call. And, you know, as always, I think 2 things just about this. One is, you know, the personal is the professional, and what we're doing is relational work. And so when, when we get together in learning environments, whether it is taking 20 minutes or whether it's taking 10 and figuring out how to do it, but just kind of letting people be a little bit more than just their name, rank, and serial number, I think is an important thing to do. So it's lovely to get to hear about the ways you've spent your holidays, even these small snippets, and I'm glad to be with you all today. What are we doing here today? So what's our purpose kind of broadly in this series? We're reviewing the modules with a 201-301 lens, trying to enhance your comfort and knowledge with the modules, creating a venue for you to discuss unique dilemmas and unique adaptations that you've discovered in delivering the content. It's an overall opportunity for you to reflect on yourself, and I would include myself in that as trainers, and to identify, how to best incorporate coaching into all of the training that we do. So that's our overall purpose of this series. Heather and I made a bit of a unilateral decision, just want to call it out, to skip Module 3 and go right from Module 4 today. We did that with an assumption that she was going to be with you for next month, which is something we're going to take up in a minute. And it seemed like a good idea to look at Module 4. Actually, I'm going to skip to that for just a second. Did that for a couple of reasons. It's a larger module for sure. If you have looked at it recently, it continues to grow. Feel like it's a little bit more complicated if you don't have a solution-focused background, and because that's an area I have a lot of training in, it just seemed to make more sense to do that on a call I was on, although Heather's quite skilled at it and does a great job with it. It just seemed like it might be better for me to lead or facilitate this one. And also the Module 3 on the working with kids is a shorter module, and one of our hopes, like while some of these clearly need to be one module per phone call, I think when we start getting down the line, we're hoping to get to 2 in some of these phone calls. We'll see if that's realistic. And since Module 3 is shorter, we thought that was a good candidate to combine with another module that's shorter, so maybe Module 8, which is the one on networks. So that's why we did this, and hope that it'll be valuable and a good decision. What are our desired outcomes for today? We will have looked at Module 4, you have a chance to ask questions, share stories, hear from each other, and to think about how to move to coaching for this. Are there other, so, I know the PDFs came late in the game, that's on me, apologize, I just got them to Michaela yesterday, but are there particular questions about solution-focused interviewing, particular things that you'd like to make sure we cover in looking at this material? Does anybody want to add a wish for a desired outcome today?
This is Marianne, and you'll probably just do this, but one of the things I really appreciate about how you do solution-focused interviewing stuff, because, it's so part of how, it's not like now I'm going to do solution-focused interviewing, like it's very much a part of how you talk and interact with people. And sometimes so what I really want some extra thought about is the ways in which to do solution-focused interviewing where it's not obvious, like this is clearly a exception-finding question, like that it's kind of subtle and tweaked so that it's more a natural way in which you would talk to a family instead of like, now let me ask you this. So the way in which it kind of like is just integrated, and the tweaks that you make so that it's more nuanced and as far as how we infuse it into our conversations.
Yeah, so I appreciate that feedback, Marianne. It's good to hear that. It's very intentional on my part. The way I got introduced to this was that these practices, whether it was solution-focused, narrative, there's a related thing called collaborative language, that this is as much a kind of worldview as it is a technique. And so I'm glad that comes across in some of my ways of working. And happy to talk about this idea of kind of integration and making it nuanced. And if for some reason I'm not hitting it, like slow me down as we go today, and let's talk about it a little bit.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, and this is Margie. You know, that's the piece for me that is really critical in mapping. It's like being able to pull out those questions that fast without it being like, okay, now I'm going to do this. So I would also love any tips you have for how to integrate it so that it's, you know, other techniques that are almost unconscious. And so I'd like it to be almost, you know, you do it without thinking. So any tips around would be great, because that's part of what I struggle with as well, is that I want to get more variety of solution-focused interviewing in my maps.
Yep. Yeah, we can talk about it. And you know what, I wonder if one of the things we can do also is, I mean, when we do we'll do it both some today, and when we look at the mapping modules, you know, we can kind of continue to think about it. But I do think it's a really important part of the mapping. The headline for me about it is, you know, increasingly I'm clear the mapping is both, you know, a consult, but it serves a socializing function as well. It's a training function. What you're hoping to do is through the process with the mapping is to imitate, you know, showcase how are you hoping the workers will work with the families. And so it's really important, I think, to land some of these questions. And, you know, I think we'll get to this in the module, but it's not just about, you know, asking questions just for the sake of asking questions, but it's really like these questions, you know, I obviously find great value in them. I think they're important and useful tools, and so if workers aren't using them, then we're missing an opportunity, right? We're missing a chance to use a tool that we think would be helpful, and so I think really important to showcase them and to really use the mapping to help show value in them. So I'm in total agreement, and let's talk about maybe as we go through these, how these might show up in mapping, but we'll also talk about it as we go through the mapping modules as well over the next couple months. So thanks for that, Margie. Anybody else with a hope for today?
So this is Andrea. I agree so much with what was said earlier, and I just want to add on to that. Techniques or tips that you would have for us about coaching the use of the questions, so that when it's sort of the right time to ask a question or the family is given a cue and a question really would help bridge to the next step, instead of the coach in the room asking that question, how do you prepare workers ahead of time? How do you cue during a meeting or whatever? So I think from the coaching perspective, how to coach someone to think about the solution-focused questions as I'm learning myself as a coach. It just, I think I was reminded when, I think it was Marianne that said it gets choppy sometimes, and I think it really does if the coach blurts out the solution-focused question in the family meeting when the worker is mapping. So sort of that dynamic as well.
Can you say that one more time, Andrea, just because it was hard to hear you for a second. When the coach is feeling choppy, do you want to say that part one more time?
Yeah, sure. Let me just go back and say I appreciate what you said, and I agree. I think the solution-focused questions are so helpful, and there's such a value in them in helping move this work. And the idea that they're sort of artful and subtle and really are based on the family's cues, and the right solution-focused question is asked at the right time based on what the conversation is and what the work is. That, I think, is an art form. But what I struggle with sometimes is, as a coach, when I'm in a family meeting and the social worker is mapping, are there any tips or tricks that you've learned over your course of coaching that would help me be more mindful about that, maybe how to prep the social worker ahead of time for the solution-focused questions, having them have some in their back pocket, that kind of a thing, because I've been in a couple meetings where I feel like, oh, I've got the right question. I know what needs to be asked now. But I don't want to disrupt that sort of the dance that's already happening between the social worker and the family. So I think solution-focused questions are so important, but how as a coach can you cue the social worker, maybe just an I wonder phrase to them, or I don't know. But I also didn't want them to be disruptive where I blurt out the solution-focused question in the middle of the meeting when it really should be the social worker who's mapping. So just from the coach's perspective, how do you coach the use of them?
That's great. Peggy, did you want to share just a quick headline?
Well, I had sent a little chat out that, it was interesting as an instructor, introducing solution-focused questioning and purposeful questioning, has been a bit of a sort of conceptual or disjointed practice. What I found, and maybe this will be helpful to Margie and Marianne and Andrea as well, is that the more that I use those questions just in my one-on-one coaching relationship with learners, it's become a natural part of what I do. And what I would say is that more important than even practicing the question is the preparation for the coaching relationship, where I am really presently listening to the person that I'm coaching with, and then the use of the questions just becomes a natural offshoot. So my advice is that the best way to feel comfortable with making solution-focused questions natural is to use them in your coaching relationship. Did that help, Phil?
Yeah. No, I think it's great, and I think it keeps us moving in the conversation. I think that's what folks are asking for. Well, let's keep going, but let's not lose this question. I'm hearing it as an important one, and as we go through, maybe as we look at the particular questions this module walks people through, again, we'll toggle back and forth between the content of the module and also kind of the way that you want to try to express these skills in your coaching. Let me check in about one thing. I know, the way the chat feature is set up here is that you all can chat to me and I can chat to you, but you can't chat to each other. So I think what Michaela's doing is if you're sending something to me, she is now broadcasting it to everybody, which is great. Thanks, Michaela. So that way if you're chatting, everybody will be able to see it. If for some reason though you're wanting to just send me a message, why don't you just write, to PD, and then Michaela will know that she shouldn't send that to everybody else. So. All right. We've talked about the context of these webinars. I think we should move ahead and appreciate the way everybody already is working together to try to get the most richness out of this. These things are deadly traps to become totally didactic, and so I'm really glad that we've worked very hard to create a different kind of atmosphere. Real quickly, just review our agreements that we're trying to make a space that everybody can share openly, as openly and honestly as possible. We have already invoked the pass rule, which is always great. When you do agreements, do you know when you feel good about it is when people invoke the agreements. And so I appreciate Peggy starting us off with that today, passing early on. So everyone has the right to pass, but we ask you to attempt to participate and to share your experience, questions, successes, and concerns. To be thoughtful about your assumptions and judgments. So if you hear something from a colleague of yours, you should probably remember that you're only hearing a tiny, tiny bit of their story. And so if you find yourself moving into any assumption or judgment, just remember you probably know 0.1% about what happened that day. That we're all trying here as a group to try on something new. So if we hear an idea before kind of moving to, well, that would never work, that we try it on in our head or heart or mind. To be mindful of process and content, intent, and impact, that sometimes we can say something with the best of intentions and it can have an impact that we didn't expect, and still need to be thoughtful about that. Just some transparent housekeeping. If for some reason you need to leave early, if you're not going to be around, if you're got a competing commitment, say a 3-month-old grandchild that you let folks know about that, as it may be making it hard for you to participate, so we don't read into silence in ways we shouldn't. That we will take a short break somewhere midway through. Anything else that we need to add to these agreements from where we've been in the past?
Yeah, Phil, I'm on an internet line, so once in a while it dies. So if you hear, you'll hear me click back on. So just so people know when they hear it, because I know that there's a sound that happens when people get back on the line. It's probably me because the internet dies up here. Does that make sense?
Thanks.
Okay.
Yep, totally does. Thanks, Margie.
Sure.
And I'm going to have to switch lines at some point, so I might be checking out and checking back in on a different line.
Great. Sounds good. Anything else? Okay. Anybody in our network who's not here today that we wish was here? Anybody want to call out someone they know was trying to make it but is not able to?
Hi, Phil. This is Soledad, and I am on the line. I have not got to my destination, so I am on mute because I am getting a lot of phone static, and I don't want to cause a lot of noise on the call.
Thanks, Soledad. Thanks for letting us know you're with us. I'm glad you're with us. All right. Jennifer and Judy, can I check in with you two? Would you like to kind of, should we save the conversation about the insight visits and I can leave some time at the end, or would you like to deal with that right now?
I could go ahead. I mean, if now feels like a good time, that's no problem.
Sure.
Okay.
Let's get the business stuff out of the way while we've got everybody on the call.
Okay. So for a variety of reasons, attendance, fiscal, collaborative, we have decided not to host an in-person meeting in February, but we'll have a webinar scheduled with Heather at that same date from 9:30 to 12:30. We will proceed with the on-site June 6th, and the Bay Area Academy and Central Training Academy will be working in the meantime to find a more centralized location for everyone instead of alternating between Fresno and Oakland. So I know some of you have made adjustments to your schedule to be at the on-site, and I apologize for any inconvenience, but this decision just felt like it made the most sense at this time. Any feedback, questions about that?
What's the date of the webinar now?
It's the same date, so it'll be the February 22nd date as the on-site, and it'll be from 9:30 to 12:30. And then the on-site will be June 6th, probably a 10 to 4-ish type time frame, but we'll work out those details in the near future.
Is there any more about the context for this change that would be good for folks to know, Jennifer?
Well, we were struggling with the attendance and travel, and there was going to be not a lot of participation in the on-site, which then kind of influenced the fiscal piece and use of resources. And in addition to that, we are very interested in sending a couple people to the March Tea for Tea that's taking place in Davis, and so this was a way for us to use those fiscal resources to support attendance at that. Anything else, Judy, you want to add?
I think the one thing I would add is with regard, you did a great job on that, Jennifer. Thank you for sharing that with everyone. I think the one thing I would add is with regard to the June on-site
And we had, like Jennifer said, this discussion just took place a couple of days ago with Bill, Judith Leffler, Jennifer, and myself. And we thought it was really important to look at that June on-site and continue with that, because we really want to get the feedback from the participants on these webinars about what worked, what didn't, all of that, and then how we can move this forward to support your continued work out there. And so Phil and Heather will be a part of that on-site in June so that we can do that. So we continue support. So that's the other thing I would add to it.
Yeah, thanks for adding that.
Sure. Is there any comments, questions with regard to that? Thanks, Phil.
Okay. And if folks have thoughts or reflections later, I presume they can be in touch with each of you as is appropriate?
Definitely.
Absolutely. Right.
Okay. Sounds good. All right, team. This is where we are. So if you're running the module series straight through, kind of as designed, one a month, as it were, we have done Module 1 and Module 2. We're skipping Module 3, and we're heading for Module 4. And like all of these modules, it first starts, kind of with a reminder about where we are, with the agreements for that particular module, with the legacy slide. And Margie, I know I have some work to do with this. I think I've mentioned before, this is a graphic that Karen has come up with that, that we've put into the modules. If it's helpful, it's just kind of a reminder about flow, about kind of the essential question which comes up in Module 2, are the children safe? That the 3 questions, that with each of those, it's not just that you're asking that question, but that you're really looking to use good questioning like these solution-focused questions that we're going to cover today to really think about impact on the child, the behavioral detail, the position of all the people that we can talk to that know the child, that we're going to do some sorting of information both through the map and through SDM. And so, this is something I think Karen and a working group in Manitoba came up with this, and so we've put it in the modules if it's helpful as a way to kind of remind people about flow. All of the modules have this slide with the safety definition on there, which, as everybody on this call will know, I usually highlight to talk about safety as a verb, safety as an action. Safety is an action taken by the caregivers that mitigates the danger demonstrated over time, and the importance of each part of that, and that this is really the pivot foot or the north on the compass. You can choose your metaphor depending on whether you're a sports fan or not. That we really start to say, we're not just interested in services or attendance at services, but we're really looking for new actions, new behaviors that address the danger. These modules have this little figure with the magnifying glass. I apologize. I'm not sure if I shared this with folks. I've been fighting a head cold too, so if I'm a little fuzzier than usual, I apologize. But I think once I get into the flow of this, I'll be good to go too. But if I'm fumbling with my words, I want you to understand what's going on. So we've tried to kind of showcase elements where you can call out particular strategies or thoughts or reflections that involve holding a trauma lens in this work. And so this slide is just a reminder to folks that obviously the impact of abuse and neglect can be traumatic for children. Many parents who we work with have been impacted by childhood trauma, that it can lead to repeating patterns, and that some of the work of this module in particular, I think, while it's not an antidote for trauma, I think really reinforces good traumatic treatment services and moves in that same direction. And one thing I might call out here, and I'm not sure it's in the speaker notes for this particular slide, but I'll just say that one of the things that trauma really does is to rob a sense of personal agency. Right? Personal agency, the sense that I can impact my world, the sense that I have a sense of control over my world. And that's one of the biggest impacts from the effects of trauma is the losing of that sense of personal agency. And at the heart of many of these questions is actually helping people to hold on to, acknowledge, reintroduce themselves to their own knowledge, wisdom, skills, etc. So in many ways it's a reconnection and a highlighting of personal agency. Even in the face of trauma, we oftentimes make choices to protect ourselves, to protect other people that are not often acknowledged, that we don't always even see ourselves. And so a lot of the questions that we'll cover today really are about that refinding of personal agency, and so in that way I think they fit a lens around trauma-informed care. All right. All of the presentations, have this slide now where you look back and reflect. And, I think as we've discovered here, it's so funny, a month, especially a month over holiday, is a long break. And so sometimes, waiting a long time, waiting a month is a short time, and sometimes waiting a month is a long time. I think I've mentioned in previous times, when I am teaching these modules, I am not afraid to look for plants, to go up to people that I know like this work and care about it and are trying to, integrate it into their work, or they're trying to learn it, they're trying to practice it, and say, hey, when we get back into that training room, I'd love it if you could share a story, even if it's a small story, so I'm so not against doing that and would encourage you to consider that. It may not be that everybody can answer all of these questions. The other thing, of course, that I would do here, sometimes with a large group, is put people into pairs, getting started with this module. Why doesn't everybody talk with a partner? Because sometimes, especially at the beginning of something like this, folks may be nervous to get their voice out into the room. They don't want to appear too aligned with the instructor at the expense of their peers, that whole teacher's pet idea. So, once they talk with a peer or in a group, it's sometimes easier to share into the room, and so I'm thoughtful about that. I do that a lot. I apologize if I've said this before. This is my memory now, but I do that a lot when there's a lot of silence in the room also, that, if I'm asking a question and not getting anywhere to me, sometimes that's a sign, I should move people into pairs. Love this picture of Insoo and Steve. I think what we do with this slide is we kind of do a pause here and we ask people what do they know about solution-focused inquiry, and ask if there's people in the room who would be willing to say something about it. I find, and you all would know better than I do as I journey across California, it's really variable, that there are some counties that actually brought Insoo out to California and, knew this work very, very deeply and intimately. And then there are some counties that really have not touched this work at all. And so I think it's useful to assess, formally or informally before you do this module, where is people's knowledge base, what's their experience. And you can even, if you haven't had the time to assess in a formal way, I think you can ask people, what do you know about this? And what's the story of a time you've been able to use it? What's the time you tried to use it, didn't work so well? Like, what's a couple headlines, and to gather folks' understanding of it. And then I like to introduce it by kind of, in some ways, saying what they were about. Insoo and Steve were part of a generation of family therapists that were really unsatisfied with both individual ways of working and also, kind of very long-term, straight insight-oriented psychotherapy, that they were quite concerned that a therapeutic environment, small t, so not even just therapy, but any kind of therapeutic environment that was solely focused on the problem, solely focused on the history of the problem, that centered around the history of the problem, could inadvertently end up making the problem stronger. And they talked about this sometimes as a kind of problem-building system, that healers, that helpers could inadvertently contribute to growing the problem by mostly focusing about it, and they were interested in creating something very different. And so that's where the solution-focused inquiry or solution-focused brief therapy comes from. And a lot of folks that are represented in that legacy slide have really worked to bring their work into child protection and child welfare work. The one thing I think that would be really important here to say, though, is as we go into this, it's really important for you to hear that what I'm talking about today is not an invitation not to talk about the problem. It's not an invitation just to minimize the problem. It's not an invitation to not ask about the abuse or the neglect or to let it go. What we're talking about and what we showcased in Module 1 and 2 in particular is this idea of a rigorous balanced assessment. And so we want to be as rigorous about the history of protection that's occurred in the family as well as the history of harm. But don't think just because we're spending this time today with solution-focused inquiry that these questions are only about the history of protection. You'll hear ways of talking about the history of harm and danger as well, but also even outside of solution-focused inquiry, sometimes there's just a time for data gathering questions, and we'll talk about that a little bit. I'm looking at the comments, guys. There was a question, and happy to have a conversation about this. So why did we put Module 3 about the working with kids where we put it? We got some feedback from San Diego County, this is the real answer, that the work with kids is very, you get a lot of buy-in around the work with kids. And so moving that further up front in the series, we originally had it later in the series, but that moving it up front, touched a lot of people. It has emotional resonance. It's got some very simple tools that people can begin to do, and that it reached people. And so that's why the Working with Kids module is where it is. You could make a case for it to go later, and if you tried it that way, I'd love to hear how it goes. I don't feel super strongly about it, but that's why it's where it is. So just to answer your questions. And by the way, please jump in at any time. Take yourself off pause. Write in a question. The whole purpose, right? We're not just doing my shtick, but is to learn from each other. So what was it that Insoo and Steve tried to do? They tried to build a practice that really used questions and conversations to help people achieve their own best judgment in difficult times, right? So it's that idea, and this is an idea that really predates, of course, Insoo and Steve, that, you can catch a fish for somebody that is hungry, and that's all well and good, and there's a time to do that, but if you help them to catch their own fish, way better, right? And so really helping people to find new ways to reflect on themselves and their own best judgment, and hopefully try to surface their past and present capacities, maybe even like how they survived trauma or how they have tried to rebuild their life since a traumatic event. Their achievements, their assets, I won't read all of these, their innovations, their strengths, in particular values, traditions, stories, cultural values, cultural traditions, cultural stories, expressions of wisdom, visions of the future. All of this with an aim of trying to help people find, again, their best judgment in difficult times. And just to be clear, and one of the things I feel like is really important when teaching this to say that the purpose of all of this is not to help people to feel good. Now, oftentimes asking solution-focused questions helps somebody to feel good, like there's an affective effect, if I can say that, right? But that's not the reason for doing it. The reason for doing it is really to help people move into a place of reflection about themselves in a way that they can manage. Two quick thoughts about this, right? bottom line, people will not make behavioral changes, the behavioral changes we want. People will not change unless they see value in the change, right? We can use our coercive power, and people will make changes, I believe, in the short term, but for long-lasting change, I think people need to see value in the change. And these questions are a way to invite people into considering maybe something different that they've done in the past, maybe that they could do something different in the future. And it's to really take them on a journey of trying to consider whether they see value in the change. So that's really at the heart of this. And again, I'm counting on all you to interrupt me, okay? There is a check-in. This is, there's a lot of exercise in this module. I meant to say this. Let me call this out. So I sent you all the trainer notes. In the third box on those trainer notes, the third bolded headline, it says estimated time for this module. It says 2 to 3 hours. You know, that's a lie. This is really a 3-hour module easily, and it could easily be 4. Is the truth. And so I think as trainers, you need to make some choices. Like I will show you where all the exercises are and talk about which ones you might consider cutting or not. But I just want to call it out. This can be a long module. And so if you are slotted in a jurisdiction for a 2-hour slot, you're going to need to do some editing. We can talk about that as we go. And those of you that have done this, I'd love to know what you've found that's worked to edit. But given the amount of exercises and purposeful reflection in here, this is a long one, and we really need to update those trainer notes. So this is easily a 3-hour module. So this exercise, again, kind of is for a jurisdiction where there are folks who've tried some of this before, because one of the things I worried about was that A, this would feel repetitive, or B, if someone had tried some of this and was in that kind of cynical, well, this doesn't work place, I didn't want them to feel like totally silenced by this, because this module, you know, talks about why we think this is such a good thing. So let's kind of get that out ahead of time. And so this is just a short exercise, again, with a group that has some experience with this. Can you think about a time you tried to use a solution-focused practice? What worked well, that you appreciated, felt was effective? What was hard or confusing or not effective, and what do you wish you could better understand? And I love those 3 questions, by the way. They're a different kind of 3 questions, but you know, I'll ask that about a lot of things, depending on where people are. You know, and you know, to some of the points that folks on this call asked about coaching. You know, one of the things I think I had to learn about solution-focused questions, or just questions in general. When I first learned these questions, you know, this comes up as a talking point later in the module, but I'll just say the thing that stuck to me, and the thing that I think is really sticky about this, is these questions are an intervention, right? The question itself is an intervention. And when I got that, like that was like light bulb going on time for me. That was a really helpful sticky message, and so that's included in this module. We think that's a good sticky message. But the problem with that is if you begin to think about these as a blunt instrument, like I'm going to use this to do something, I'm going to make you find an exception, I'm going to help you find a preferred future, they become things you're doing to somebody and not with somebody. And so somewhere along the line I encountered the language of a question asked with genuine curiosity. You know? And one of the things I've found is that I can ask 5 solution-focused questions with no curiosity whatsoever, like I'm already thinking about, ooh, what's my next question to move them along, as opposed to just one with genuine curiosity that actually makes much more difference, you know, than the 5 with no curiosity or limited curiosity. So just a FYI, you know, so even in a training context, certainly in a coaching context, with genuine curiosity, asking workers, what did you do that's worked well about any of these tools? What did you think was effective? What would you want others of your peers to know? What was hard? Was there anything that was hard? What was confusing? What didn't work that you'd want others to know? And what do you wish you could better understand? I think, you know, it's just it's a lovely way to kind of walk people through a debrief about a piece of work, and I think certainly kind of going into this can be really useful and lets people know you're wanting to bring their wisdom out as well as, you know, the trainer's wisdom. Can I just pause there and check in this idea of offering questions with genuine curiosity? Does anybody want to make a comment about that, or is that taking anybody anywhere?
Phil, I think it's great because actually I see it all the time in the classroom. They're doing it to people, and I just had a situation with a supervisor where I was like, oh, I just can't figure it out. So, I mean, where to have them jump over the bridge. And so I think that whole idea of, are you genuinely curious, or are you going down the list, you know, of questions you're going to ask to make them what it is you want them to do. So I think it's actually, in fact, it's going to be a poster in my classroom.
Yeah.
So it's a wonderful question to ask them. Just, are you doing it to them or with them? Because it's a nice frame, and, you know, how curious are you about the answer? Or what I see a lot is they think they already know the answer, rather than I really want to know what the answer is.
I really like that addition, Margie, that I do think people start to think they know the answer, and you know, either they know the answer and so they shut down from listening, or they're all into these questions and so they're already thinking about what's the next question I need to ask. And then you've lost that curiosity, or what Ryan is calling in the text wonderment. Ryan, you want to say anything more about wonderment?
Yeah, Ron and I were just talking about this yesterday, actually. It's one thing to train internal coaches to these questions, and then when they go practice them in the field, and we kind of observe them, or they have some good self-reflection, it does feel like still a little bit like an interrogation, like we're going after them to try to nail them or put them on the spot, or have them have an aha moment like, see, I told you. And that spirit doesn't necessarily shift just because we're asking questions versus telling. So I think, like you said in the beginning, Phil, it's just a way of being that you walk in the door with. And even if you don't nail the question exactly as it's kind of taught, the spirit is there, and that's, I think, what helps build the self-reflection for the client, having them look inward and figuring out with probably the most accuracy compared to anyone what really would work to rebuild a foundation of safety for them. And then we're partnering in that self-assessment as they kind of come forward with more and more info. But I think that wonderment brings people's emotionality and resistance down so they can have some honest looking inward with us there in the room, hopefully at least.
Yeah, and with that, thanks, Ryan. What that reminds me of also is just, you know, and it actually comes up in this next slide. We can keep this conversation going, but, you know, so the next slide is a reminder that, you know, the single biggest predictor of positive outcomes in child welfare appears to be the good working relationships developed between the worker, the family, and other helping professionals. And, you know, these questions are aligned with that idea. These questions are ways to actually have some very difficult conversations in ways that people can actually participate and feel like they're being asked with curiosity and not with judgment. And so I think that's really important. And I would go so far to say, look, there's nothing that prevents somebody from using a solution-focused question as an interrogation technique. And then you are moving against not only the spirit of this, but I think the effectiveness of it both. So, anybody else with a quick comment about this idea of asking a question with genuine curiosity? There's a slide here that just is kind of a reminder that these are tools. You know, no tool will work with everybody. None of these questions are guarantees of anything. But we think that the more of these that you have, the more of these that you can use, the better things will go. And they add to what you can do in your work with families. And what I'll even say, and this comes up again, is there are also tools at how to avoid some typical kinds of dead ends that can happen in this work. And so we'll talk about that a little bit. Next up is this somewhat lengthy, I mean, not really, but it is kind of 10 to 15 minutes. It's longer than some other exercises. If you've got the trainer notes in front of you, this begins the middle of page 3 and moves almost all the way to the bottom of page 4. Most of the people on this call have heard me do this, I think. And so I'm not going to do it for real, but I'll just kind of say it so you can hear again the pacing that I use with this exercise. So I tell people that I'm going to do a visualization. I promise them it will not be touchy-feely. For some reason, the word visualization scares some people, although you are all in California, so perhaps it doesn't scare as many people out there as it does in Massachusetts. But so I say we're going to do a visualization. You can look at me. You can look at the floor. You can close your eyes, whatever's comfortable. I'm going to ask you a series of questions. You can go wherever you want to in your head or your heart. You're not going to have to share what you think about. That can remain totally private. But I am going to ask you what the effect of this exercise is. And so that's what we're going to ask people if they feel comfortable debriefing. Marianne is asking if we can see the trainer notes on ReadyTalk. I think Marianne, this got sent out as a separate email. And so you should have it in your email box. Sorry, it's not, I don't think it is on the, yep, good. So, and by the way, this is an exercise I kind of co-developed with a mentor of mine, Sally Ann Roth, here in Massachusetts. I like to give Sally Ann credit. It goes like this. I'd like you to think for a moment about something you've done, personal or professional, that left you feeling quite proud of yourself. This might be something you've done at work that you've been striving for, that you feel particularly good about. Maybe it's an accomplishment at home that you've done recently that really matters to you. But take 20 seconds and think about something you've done recently that left you feeling quite proud of yourself. And then I, as the trainer, need to really take a breath and let them think, right? So if you do an exercise like this, you really don't want to let your excitement, anxiety, whatever, start rushing you through it. But so I will count to myself or, look at my watch or whatever. And then the second part of this image is now I'd like you to imagine you're having a conversation with somebody who really gets you about this moment that you've done something you're proud of. I want you to imagine you're having a conversation with somebody who really gets you. And it's important that you use that language. It's italicized in the trainer notes. I want you to imagine having a conversation with someone who really gets you about that moment. What would it be like to be in that conversation? What kind of an effect would it have on you? Take 20 seconds again and just think about what it would be like to have a conversation about this thing you're really proud of with somebody who really gets you. Okay? 20 seconds there. And then I say, okay, that's the first image. That's the first conversation. Here's the second. Now I'd like you to think about a moment you've done something, again, it can be personal or professional, that you don't feel so especially proud of. I often like to tell people, do not pick the most toxic thing that you have done in the last 6 months, but pick something that you've done that feels meaningful, but maybe feels comfortable to think about in a training exercise. Again, you're not going to have to share this, but something you've done where you don't feel so especially proud. Again, you won't have to share this. Take 20 seconds, pick the thing you've done that you don't feel so especially proud of. So people start to think about that. I go 20 seconds, and then I say, now I'd like you to imagine you're having a conversation about that thing you've done you're not so especially proud of with someone who never gets you. Okay, and when I say that, you can almost feel the air get sucked out of the room. I give people a few seconds. How would it feel to be in that conversation about the thing you're not so proud of with the person who never gets you? How fully would you be able to participate? How present would you be able to be in that conversation? How fully would you be able to make plans with that person? I pull people back after 20 seconds there, and I say, let's come back as a group, and please remember you're always more than, the worst thing that we've done, And then let's debrief this exercise again. I'm going to ask you not to share the images, but I'd like to talk about what was the process of doing this exercise like. Was there a difference between conversation 1, where you were talking with someone who really gets you about the thing you're proud of, and conversation 2, the conversation about the thing you weren't so proud of with the person who never gets you? What were the differences in those conversations? And we debrief that in the room. And there's some trainer notes here. What most often happens is people say, in the first conversation I was excited, I had plenty to talk about, it was great, and in the second conversation I felt shut down. I was like, why bother? It felt like, it wouldn't make a difference no matter what I said. Sometimes people say the second conversation's motivating. I wanted to prove them wrong. That's okay, that's fine to hear. And then I ask folks, what's the point? Why do you think we're doing an exercise like this? And I like to bring up a couple of things. People really quickly get it, that, this kind of mimics in some way a lot of the work that we're doing, that we're meeting families oftentimes at a moment where they have done something they don't feel very proud of. And it's actually kind of like threading a needle to have a real conversation with somebody, potentially a stranger, about something they've done that they don't feel proud of. It's a very challenging thing. How are we going to have this dialogue in a way that doesn't increase the shame and blame, but does still, hold you accountable for thinking about your actions and what you could be doing differently? I think it highlights the real delicate nature of the conversations we have. The other thing I like to point out with this is that the kinds of conversations we have really will change the kinds of relationships we make, right? And so if we have a conversation where people feel listened to, respected, honored, even about very hard things, we're going to make one kind of relationship. If we have a conversation where people feel with more blame and shame, obviously that's going to be a different kind of relationship. Let me pause here and ask if people have questions, or if anybody has tried this exercise, what it's been like for you, what's worked about it, what hasn't. Any reflections about this?
Bill, this is Todd. I've not tried it, but in doing this, I kind of wondered, for those who aren't completely bought into this already, do you get feedback sometimes like, well, this exercise is an example of how friends would communicate. I'm not this person's friend. I'm a professional, and we don't have that type of rapport or relationship. Anybody kind of come at you from that angle, and how did you deal with it?
Yeah. Todd, I'll answer that, but let's collect up, and maybe somebody else as we go might want to comment on that, but I'll write it down. I promise I won't leave this slide without talking about this. So if somebody says, this is how a friend would talk, I'm not a friend. Do folks have ideas about that, or other people have questions or reflections about this exercise? I promise I won't forget, Todd.
Phil, this is Ryan. I wasn't doing the SOP module, but I was using this exercise, little modification to it actually, with some managers and directors for a county. And I think it's tricky when there's not emotional safety or perceived emotional safety in the room, because if there's relationship history with the people that are in attendance and you ask this kind of a question, it's a trigger for a lot of that baggage potentially for them. And if they aren't really steeped at modulating as a group or individually, it can be a challenge that you throw out, which I don't think is necessarily a bad thing, as long as you're in alignment with the goals of the group. So it can be a way to move them there on purpose, but you have to be ready for what comes up, I think. And I think Todd's point speaks to that a little bit. We had some of that happen, and then we had to ask him, where do you want to go in terms of your relationships as a team together? How deep, how personalized do you want to make it? How safe or segregated does it need to be for you? and they chose to go deeper, and I think a lot of people do when it feels safe, but it takes some getting there, I think.
Thanks, Ryan. Other folks with questions or reflections about this exercise, if you've tried it or what you think hearing it today?
My experience with it is that there are a few people in the room who really get it, kind of touches them, they got it, right? There are other people in the room that just don't get it. They don't, and you have to spend a lot of time kind of going through it, but at this point, you're like at 10, 15. So, and you really want to get, I really want to get to the solution-focused interviewing, so, but it would be an activity that you could really flesh out and spend time with in terms of that whole issue about whether or not they're cops, particularly when you get ER people in the classroom who really feel like their job is to be a cop. So, so I had mixed feelings about it, but I think it was worth doing. I mean, because there were people that really got it.
Thanks, Margie. I want to leave some space for anybody else to jump in, but I'll just respond real quick. So, Todd, if somebody, yeah, you know, I think what I would just say is, you know, that I think there is a difference between solution-focused interviewing or inquiry and being a friend. But what I would say to somebody who said that to me is that, would you mind, like, I think that's an important point, though, because I really do, because our job is not to be friends. And so would you be willing, as we go forward in this module, to hold on to that worry? Like, I'll join you with it, but can you watch this material and see when we get through the end of it, are you still worried about that? And if so, what do we need to do to be careful about that? You know, so I'd kind of join with them around the fear about it. I'd say that's not my perspective. I don't think this positions us as friends. I think this helps us to have conversations about things that are hard to have conversations about. And I think it helps us actually do a more rigorous and more balanced assessment, but I want to be open to the possibility that it could take us down the wrong path, and so I'd invite you to be watchful about that. I'd invite the whole group to be watchful about it, and let's make sure we take some space at the end to see where we are with it. You know, so that's kind of my dance with somebody along that is, you know, the fear is a real one. We don't want people thinking that they should be friends. Like, it's not that friends are bad, but that's not our purpose here. And I don't think that's what this is about. So kind of like there's a little like, I'm not going to pick a fight with you about this. I think your caution is an important one, and I don't think that's where this goes. And let's see together. And you know, it's kind of like inviting them into a place of reflection about the material. Like, hold that view, look at this, and let's see where we go. So where does that take you, Todd? I'm just curious.
I think that works. I mean, just kind of co-opting them and just saying I'm acknowledging your feelings, and kind of let's see how it plays out, so to speak. My gut response, coming from maybe not a strength-based approach, is maybe just to draw the other extreme. Not to say that they do it, but let's say, you know, we're doing something and you're definitely going after that person and trying to find out exactly what they did and that they need to be held accountable for that. What type of professional atmosphere does that create, so that in a way you're juxtaposing the two? Does that make sense?
I lost you somewhere in there. Can you say it one more time, maybe a little differently?
Sure. It just in the other end of the extreme, to show how somebody's more accusatory type of behavior might be also damaging to the professional relationship. If you take the other end of the extreme, where you're taking the very co-opted, just come and play with me, I'm going the other way, just saying, not that you're doing this, but what happens if someone were to act this way? What does that do to the professional relationship between the client?
Yeah, that's nice. That's nice. And actually, you could use both strategies. You could say, you know, can you be watchful about this? And here's what I'm worried about. It's when we approach people in a way that, like that second conversation where we never get them, you know, about the thing that they're not so proud of, it's going to be very hard for us to do some work together. So, no, I like that too. Yeah, thanks.
I
have a question, Phil. This is Andrea. Just a thought that just occurred to me. Even I wonder in the setup of the exercise, when we say visualize, sharing that with somebody who really gets you, if we could take a second and say, it doesn't have to be a friend, it doesn't have to be a spouse or somebody that you know intimately well, but it could be somebody that really understands you, has some honesty with, maybe a boss, maybe a coworker. But I wonder if that takes care of it to some degree, because I wonder if people just go right into, their very best friend or something, so people in the room automatically put it in terms of a friendship.
I'd be really interested to hear if you try it that way, how it goes. I don't think there's any reason why that wouldn't work well. I haven't heard that a lot, the kind of the friend piece, but I think that would forestall some of that, and I'd encourage you to give it a try. I think it's a nice idea. Yeah. Other thoughts about this, Ryan? The emotional safety part. I do think, obviously with all of these trainings, even just like the little check-in we did, folks, at the beginning, I think, again, training and coaching are relational activities, and the more safety, that you can make in the room, the more people feel like they can be fully present in the room, the better the training is going to be, the more they're actually going to really take away. It's part of the reason why we create those agreements, and agreements aren't a guarantee of people feeling like they can be present, but they're an effort to move in that direction. And so I certainly agree that if you've got a group that you're working with for a while, where there's beginning to build some relationship, I think you're going to get further than parachuting in and doing this. And it is one of the reasons why I actually get kind of strong about some of the guidelines about this. Like I tell people, you're not going to have to share the image. You can go where you want to go with this. Is to just try to build in a lot of protection for them to get the maximum value out of the visualization. While feeling safe enough to participate. So, but the point, Ryan's well said. Anybody else with any comments or questions about this? All right, I'm going to try to push this ahead a little bit. I love, by the way, that I think that's a really useful exercise for moving into a dialogue about solution-focused questions, and it's one I would keep, by the way. Those of you who've got to do some cutting, I'll talk about cutting. I think there's still value in that exercise, even in a short version of this module. And I think there's other ways to make the point. What I'm really hoping people leave that conversation with is I'm getting distracted by a chat message, which will come out in a sec. What I'm really hoping people leave that exercise with is this idea is that different conversations change the different kinds of relationships that we make. And so we need to be attentive to the kinds of conversations we're having. Doesn't mean we be nice. That's not where we're trying to land. So maybe that's similar. What I like to tell people is this isn't a practice about being nice. It's a practice about being rigorous and really creating opportunities for rigorous reflection. So, yeah. All right. So in this module, we've selected 5 solution-focused questions to highlight, and certainly, and I think the people on this call would know this. There's thousands of solution-focused questions. There's a terrific book called 1001 Solution-Focused Questions. I'd encourage you to take a look at it. It's actually got a chapter with 1001 Solution-Focused Questions, and there's more. But I think from the position of adult educators, sometimes it's hard. Like I think the number 5 is a nice number to try to remember. You start creeping over 5, it gets hard. So we picked out these 5 as 5 questions that we've seen as really useful in child welfare work in particular, that we thought were easy to remember. There were other ones we certainly could have added to this, and you may find that it's good to teach other ones. So when I get to this slide, I say this is what we're going to review. We're going to talk about exception questions, which are really great questions for surfacing past examples of protection that parents have been able to do with their children. Scaling questions, which are really about helping people both to share their judgment and reflect on themselves in ways that are a little more sophisticated, just a little more than yes-no questions, and also to think about small steps for change. Coping questions, which try to surface solutions even in the face of great difficulty. Preferred future questions, which are really about a vision of what could be. And then these things that we sometimes call position questions, and again, if this is a group that's gotten some solution-focused training, that we actually have a version of this, I apologize, it says relationship or position questions. In the solution-focused literature, these questions are called relationship questions. As CRC has been teaching us in California, we've called these position questions. It just seems to make a little bit more sense, like, you're asking people to take up the position of somebody else, but I don't like to confuse people that have gotten solution-focused training, and so those position questions and what the SF literature calls relationship questions are really the same thing. We're going to take a break in just a couple minutes. Again, why do we think there's value in this is that we can go down a flow, sometimes without even realizing it, of making a comment that we don't intend to be hurtful, but can have an impact that's hurtful in some way. It can move to some assumption of our being malicious or our having a poor intent. We can feel that from families, and we can move into this place with our conversations that are just about a collection of evidence and a determination to be right. And so this is a kind of a frequent path that our dialogues with families can get pulled into, even despite our best efforts. And one of the things about solution-focused questions is they try to pull us out before this gets too out of hand. At its base, what's important for you to know about these solution-focused questions, they are an intervention. They're strategic in the sense they're designed to do something. They're not neutral questions. They're really trying to achieve something. One thing they're trying to achieve is they're trying to generate an experience for the person being asked. They're trying to take that person somewhere with the hope that they might get some new understanding. Like, and this is where sometimes some of you have seen me do this, I'll say, like, I can ask somebody, what's your favorite color? What's your favorite sports team? What's your favorite hobby? And you might answer, it's blue, it's the 49ers, I like to knit. Now I know a piece of information about you. That's a data gathering question. Solution-focused questions are really trying to do something else. How were you able to take that step? What does that say about what you're committed to? Has there ever been a time when you could have gone off, offline? You could have, done something that you wouldn't have been proud of, but you managed to do something different. How did you do that? Right? The idea of this is to help people recognize exceptions and solutions from their own history that might otherwise have been disregarded. And again, I want to keep highlighting for folks, and I do here, this is not just about being nice. If somebody can remember a time and a way that they were able to do something different, they are more likely to be able to repeat it, right? And so this isn't just about helping someone to feel good, it's helping them to find some of their own answers. Yeah. I see Ryan's got some nice bumper sticker language here that people can look at in the chat message. They're designed to create space for critical reflection with minimal blame and shame. And one thing about these questions is they take some practice and skill and rigor to learn well. This slide kind of just reinforces this piece I just did about like how is this different? They're not data gathering questions. One thing to be thoughtful of, if you kind of are living only in the world of data gathering questions, I think that's going to feel like a whole lot of questioning for someone. That's close to interrogation. I think if all you did was solution-focused questions, that could feel like a miss to somebody. And I'd say there's some potential of living in naive practice if all that we do is just, try these solution-focused questions. And so we're trying to kind of live in the both-and world. And one tip before we go into this, I think, is just to think as you're kind of doing this work about what you're hoping to learn more about, what you're hoping to help your client to think about, and then think about, of these questions, which is going to help me to kind of go there a little bit, and to try it, and not to be afraid to reword it a few times. You know, one of the things I tell trainees is that I think it's okay to be vulnerable with the families you're working with, and to say, like, I'm trying to learn a different skill. You know, and so this may come out a little bit weird. So these slides that we've done so far, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So there's about 20 slides here. I'm not counting exactly. This is really the precursor to getting into the questions. And then what happens from here on out is there's 5 sections, right? There's a section on exception questions. There's a section on scaling questions. Those are both reasonably large. Like I'd say there's about just roughly 10 slides each in each of those sections. And then there's much smaller sections on the position questions, the coping questions, and the preferred future. So, you know, one way to think about this is kind of like preamble, like that 2 conversations, and the initial stuff is kind of like the preamble, what is this stuff? And then there's the 5 sections here, focused one each on each of those questions. And so I'm thoughtful, even just looking at this, that like if I was trying to be careful about time, a lot of these, you know, I can make the same point without showing the slide, right? I think this is a little of Phil Dector, Karen Martin, and Heather Meitner getting slide happy, which you know is a danger of ours, and yes, probably more a danger of mine than anyone else's. But I'm working on it. So the thing just to be thoughtful about is, do you need all of these to make the point? And so, you know, I encourage you to be judicious and use what you think is most important. For me, again, my 10 cents, I think the 2 conversations exercise, the introduction to these 5 questions, this slide here that's got the questions about the solution-focused inquiry and what they're designed to do. In some ways, I can make the points I need to in that section off of those 3 slides. You know, I still would use the why do we think this is important earlier, et cetera, et cetera. So. I am thinking before we go into the exception questions, this is a good time for our little 7-minute break. Is that, what did you do with Heather last time? Did you do a 5-minute break, a 10-minute break, a 7-minute break? Anybody?
We went
We did a 10-minute break.
A 10-minute break.
Marianne is telling a fib. It was 5 minutes.
Oh, really? Oh, I honestly remembered it being 10.
All right, can I suggest the 7-minute break? I'm going to leave the phone on. If some of you need to hang up and call back in, that's fine. But can we try to do the 7-minute break because we got lots to do? And then we'll move ahead. And then Ryan has a question when we come back. So I'll see you all in 7 minutes.
Sounds good.
want to let folks know I'm back on the call, but we're still about 3 or 4 minutes from our 7 minutes.
Okay, so can I walk you through my questions to make it more succinct while we're waiting for people?
Sure. If you think, though, it's a question other folks would want to hear the answer to, do you want to wait just a couple minutes?
Well, I'm worried I might not be as eloquent as I should be. So can I kind of frame the concept, and then I can say the question when folks get back, maybe?
Sure.
Okay, so it's the idea that you were just thinking about maybe as a teaching modality being kind of slide heavy and kind of maybe more didactic versus maybe being more like playing jazz, maybe more group process. So I'm imagining in my head there's like 3 different parallels here that I'm comparing and trying to figure out where would I move the amount of solution-focused work for engagement in one direction or the other, from a worker to a family perspective at some point in the case, maybe say ER interviewing, from a coach to a worker perspective when we're learning SOP, which is what I'm using the most. And right now I'm probably at 70%. I'm shooting for SFQs in all of my conversation versus maybe where I started where I was doing maybe 40% SFQs and a lot of the time just didactic teaching. And trying to push it even farther based on how well they're learning it. And then I'm wondering about then what happens in the classroom when you're training. Because it seems like the tendency is to be the most didactic, and I'm wondering if there's a flow that makes sense logically, why you would do it. It's like a one-shot deal with people, their first taste of the information. And then how do you conceptualize moving that more towards inquiry and less towards telling in those 3 different kind of strata?
So Ryan, I want to make sure I'm understanding the question. Is it why would you start slide heavy? Like, what's the benefits and the dangers of starting slide heavy? Is that the question, or?
I think I'm wondering, like, when do you move it away from that in terms of transfer of learning, moving through those different strata? Because in the beginning, they don't know what they don't know. It's a foreign concept. So you have to give a little bit of information before they can start wrapping their minds around it. So that makes sense. But then as you transfer it further away from the initial training, when and how do you move that more towards asking questions versus continuing to kind of lead them really explicitly? Because you lose time, I think that's the trade-off that workers are, that's the continuum is. You're having to teach knowledge they don't know, but once they have a sense of it, you want to give them more time to play in it themselves, but you lose time potentially compared to just telling people.
Yeah. So folks will be coming back, and as you come back, Ryan is asking a question about kind of, I think, again, Ryan, check me on this, like the when and the how of moving away from kind of didactic to experiential, and moving away from kind of like, so, a danger with this whole setup of the modules, right, is that it can be seen as a very didactic thing. We've got speaker notes. It's like, read the speaker notes that go with that slide kind of thing. And that was really never our intention. It was to lay out these different components, lay out these different tools, lay out these different approaches in a way that other people could teach, in a way you all could teach and get started teaching. And then to hopefully provide enough exercises like those 2 conversations exercise, like the ones that come up soon at the end of each of these 5 sections, so that people could get an experiential piece. And, in general, my sense is that it's, I have begun to think about training as kind of an orientation, if you can follow me for a sec. It's like I've really lost a lot of faith in my belief that training actually changes behavior, And here we are all engaged in training and spending a lot of time talking about training. Maybe the tighter way to say it is training alone, I am pretty convinced, does not change behavior. But I think if we lose training completely, there's some loss in that. An orientation to something is useful. An orientation makes sure that we all get the same information to begin with. An orientation makes sure there's basic concepts that have been at least shared, if not understood. An orientation, can kind of help say, this is where we're going, this is what we think is valuable with this. But I'm really clear that if we don't move to the coaching and the practice and the demonstration and the experiential stuff, that, then we're not doing anything. And child welfare is full of examples, and everybody on this call has had examples of, participating in trainings that don't make any difference whatsoever. So I don't know if I'm touching in the right zone, Ryan, so you can pull me where you were hoping I would speak to. But I think there's value in doing something like this that begins to expose people to an orientation to this material, and I think it's really clear to me that we need to move beyond this relatively quickly. I was doing a version of this with folks from Colorado yesterday who also had similar amnesia from before New Year's, and they were saying, God, if I can't remember month to month, how can we expect our trainees to get it? And I said, absolutely, and I think that's why the coaching to me is non-negotiable, and that's to me why working with supervisors to make this a part of supervision, why I think a format like mapping that can be replicated in family team meetings and in group consultations is really important, that we're getting shared language throughout the organization. So I don't know, Ryan, am I in the right ballpark?
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. And I was thinking the questions that I was hearing in the beginning of the call about how some of the challenges that come up or worries are kind of maybe reflective of that didactic teaching approach that we've all kind of had, because it is the front end of orienting us to the material. But if we don't find ways to move away from that orientation as we convey it in our coaching sessions or even in smaller group trainings, then I think we pass on that challenge as well to our learners, that they'll still have some of those issues that we're actually struggling with potentially. That's my hunch, at least. Open to feedback.
Yeah.
Yeah, this for me is like this huge issue that I struggle with, particularly as we do SOP training. And so they are the happiest campers in my classroom when they get to apply whatever we're talking about to a case. And so I'm kind of thinking that we should even break it down to smaller bits of information, that the mods have too much information in them, and then can we break down little pieces. But I also am really leery of, because, training for 25 years, if we also don't have some kind of this is the information we impart, orientation-based knowledge, then what I've seen happen in the past is people misconstrue things. All of a sudden you have a bunch of weird practice that they think they got out of a class, but they didn't get the theory behind it or the meat behind it, so it just evolves. So it's balance between how do we get enough theory and interesting theories they can retain. And for me, orientation is a good word, because I actually think training is about motivating people. If you're just trying to get them to want to try on a new idea. But then the mods are some of the mods are dense in terms of practice. For example, the interviewing children, if we just did the 3 houses, we're done, because they can try it on several times, and they can try it on several times and do activities in the classroom. They get much more out of it. They're happier campers. So then it becomes, part of me wants to make it 24 mods, break it down. Not that's kind of crazy, but into even smaller increments, so they can try it on every class more than once, several ways.
Yeah.
There's my 2 cents.
Yeah, no, and I'd like to keep this conversation going, but I just want to do kind of, amen.
Yes.
What we would do in Massachusetts when we were really cooking is we'd do the mod and then we'd do a coaching session with people in between, and we wouldn't have PowerPoint, and, we'd talk much more about practice, and we'd pick some particular things. And so I'm thinking about some of the comments folks made in the beginning, Marianne, Andrea, others, about kind of subtlety and integration and stuff. One thing I used to do is, give people one question to try. So if we were doing a consult about a particular family and we'd come up with a couple of questions, I'd write them down on index cards and give them back to the worker or to the team that was working with the family and say, go try those and come back and tell me what kind of difference they make, if any. What do you learn? What do you not learn? I think similar to what we've talked about that I've talked about with some of you about my experience with Three Houses, very early on, not knowing, well, what's a coach and what am I supposed to do? I went out to, a particular supervisor, and I'm worried I told this story, but I'll just give you the highlight really quickly. I was working with a unit of investigators who were very skeptical about this thing, and who was this coach, and what were we doing? And the unit supervisor, who was this real veteran in the organization, said, listen, everybody, stop complaining about this. Here's what we're going to do. You're all going to try Three Houses, one with an older kid, one with a younger kid, and then Phil's going to come back in 3 weeks, and we're going to talk about what we learned. And I thought to myself, oh my God, I finally know what I'm supposed to do as a coach. It was like a lesson for me about, scaffolding small pieces of learning, right? And, this is a very heavy module, but what I would love if you guys came out of this was with some agreement with your trainees, or if you do a coaching session, just to try one thing. And that's why I actually put up this slide here. Partially, I'll tell you another reason in a minute, but just what's one question you want to try with one family? Just to practice something and to move that forward, and then to come back and just have a conversation about it. So whether it's 24 modules, whether it's coaching in between, whether it's coaching afterwards, I'm fully in support of all of these approaches. I heard someone trying to break in.
Yeah, Phil, this is Andrea. I think I was the one that had the initial questions around coaching. I loved the frame about what are you curious about? What do we want to know? What are you interested in? That might be a great way to start the prepping before you're going to coach a social worker through mapping. What are you curious about? So I love the solution-focused questions, sort of the point or the grounding is that we're supposed to be curious, not like a technician applying the right question at the right time, but what are we really curious about? And that, I think, would be a good way to prep maybe a social worker prior to going in with the family. Just help them reflect ahead of time, maybe.
Absolutely. No, I really like that. Some of you were asking, I think, Andrea, you asked about this, but Marianne, too, about cues and thinking about the mapping. I just thought I'd share with you, because we'll go through this in detail around the questions, but kind of thinking about your role as leaders in organizations and as coaches, people trying to support this practice. So exception questions, we'll go through this in a sec, but just a reminder, has there ever been a time when the problem could have happened but didn't, right? That's the base exception question. And so to me, when I'm mapping or doing any kind of case consult, and I'm hearing lots of examples of the history of the problem, that's where I'm going to want to pull back and make sure I've asked an exception question. And I actually think it's really an important learning and socialization moment that if a worker is really, really stuck in that, kind of, and then this horrible thing happened, and then this horrible thing. Like, I want to get there. I'm going to keep it. What else happened? What else are you worried about? What else are you worried about? And then I'm going to look them right in the eyes and with real curiosity at my best, try to say, has there ever been a time when X could have happened but didn't? And to try to make some space for them to say, I don't know, I didn't ask that. And then to say, do you think that would be valuable to ask? Would you be curious about the answer to that? Who would know the answer to that? Who would you want to talk to, right? So to me, the exception questions really help to populate the what's working well side of our balanced assessment, right? And what cues me into the need to ask exception questions is when we're only living in a very, what Michael White used to call a very problem-saturated description of the family. I want to just say similarly, if all I'm hearing about is, oh, they're a great family, they're fabulous, I am going to want to say, well, why are we talking about this? Who's worried about what? So it is, to me, that's that cue for that balance, but the exception question to me is really about kind of like the balance of the what's working well. The other thing, by the way, which we'll get to again in a second with the exception questions, is sometimes it's not, especially when we think about our work, I didn't do the problem or I didn't have the problem, but sometimes is I still kept my kids safe. So an example, so one kind of exception question, was there ever a time that you could have gotten high, but somehow manage not to. That's one question. Another question might be, has there ever been a time before you got high you managed to make sure there was somebody sober looking after your kids? Can you tell me about that? Can you tell me when you did that, why you did that, how you did that, et cetera, et cetera? So that's what I'm listening for as a cue to exception questions. Scaling questions, a couple of places. One is when we're not in a place of nuance. You know, the family hates us, or you know, the family thinks this is useless, or no, they're in total denial, or so when somebody's describing something as or the family's totally terrific, you know, like, so, you know, again, we'll come to this in a second, but the message for me about scaling is when we're in kind of the land of either or. Scaling can take us to a place of nuance and small steps. That's the other place, by the way, that I find real value in scaling questions, is when folks, like, so when the families we work with in the situations we're working with are at extremes, and it feels very hard to feel like, you know, there could be change possible. So essentially, you know, we're at 2 on a scale of, you know, to 10. If all everyone is thinking about is the 10, you know, that's just an invitation to despair. And so taking something and putting it on a scale and thinking, what would up by 1 look like? What would up by 2 look like? You know, can reawaken motivation for everybody and some hope and some possibility. So those are the 2 places that cue me for scaling. One is the either or, and the other is when people seem to be falling into that despair. There's no way this could ever get different. Coping questions, similarly, almost to exception questions, but coping questions when I've heard a long history of trauma or of difficulty or of problem, but there's some empty space there that's not been storied up yet. You know, how have they survived since then? How have they coped? That's what I'm listening for with coping questions. Preferred future, 2 places, kind of similarly, both with families and with workers. When I haven't heard what the family is hoping will be different in their life, and if the family hasn't spoken about what will be different, we'll cover this again in a second, but the quick headliner about preferred future questions. And by the way, anybody steeped in solution-focused questions will know, like, a miracle question in some ways is a preferred future question. Miracle question, what if you go to bed tonight, a miracle occurs, you know, what's the first thing you'll notice? It's a lovely question, and we didn't include it here because I think it's a question that invites people to kind of parachute into a much more, you know, to a future life that they're hoping for. But oftentimes in our families, like, stretching the miracle is too far a stretch. Like, it's too big a leap right from where we're meeting them. And so preferred futures are more general, and really the idea that you can't make change if you don't have a vision of where you're trying to go, that it's very, very hard if you don't have a vision where you're trying to go. Many of you have heard me talk about dead man's goals. Dead man's goals are goals framed as an absence, not a presence. A preferred future question is really about filling in that presence. Where are we headed? And so I'm listening for that when a worker is only talking about services. I'm listening for that when a family is only talking about what they're trying to stop. I want to know, where are we going? You know, and safety is going to be my goal. Safety and permanency is going to be my goal. Safety, permanency, well-being. But I want to know what the family's goal is too. And then the relationship questions or the position questions, I think what I'm listening for there as a cue is kind of only hearing one perspective, right? And so this can be in a consultation when a worker is really just living in their point of view or just in one particular parent's point of view. That's where I'm going to say, you know, like if the worker's kind of just in, like, say, the mandated reporter's point of view, you know, so if the parent was here, what would they say? And oftentimes, you know, again, if we see mapping and consultation as both a training vehicle as well as a consult vehicle, you know, asking if the parent was here, what would they say they're most worried about? if the child was here, what would they say they're most worried about? Like I think, and again, with genuine curiosity, can really help showcase, wow, you know, I haven't asked that, you know, and so if you make a space where people can say that, like I might say this, like I'm going to ask you some questions during this mapping, you may not, and some of you would have heard me do this, right? I'm going to ask you some questions during this mapping you may not know the answers to. It's okay, but if we think they're valuable questions, maybe we'll put them in the next steps as things you might want to think about asking the family. So let me pause there. I just wanted to make sure I was responding to some of the things folks checked in about at the beginning around integration and cues. Anybody want to make any quick comments about that last little spiel I just did, or any thoughts about where that's taking you?
Well, Phil, it's Ryan. I love the opportunity to integrate the trauma-informed focus for both the workers and the families for here, because like you mentioned, the times where you choose to selectively use certain solution-focused questions. And I think all of those times I was imagining, what are parents or workers feeling when they're expressing that way? And they're usually pretty triggered. And sometimes that's when it's the hardest for workers to work with families. So I think having an awareness of that sense of being triggered and knowing which question you want to use strategically to pull them out of that emotional state can be really helpful. But also, like you said, the last example of when to pull them back in if they're too detached from some of the emotional connection to the impact on the child, for example. So I think that's a deeper level of training that I think the workers can grasp. But it comes a little bit, I think, from their experience, like you were mentioning in the field. But I think to kind of open the door early might be a nice way to help them get ready for that.
Well, and I think if you think about the trauma lens, too, I mean, really that's our task in a lot of ways, is to find that balance between drawing them back in and not drawing them so far in, because we're not their therapist. You know, like finding that balance between having them be attached to the feelings and emotions and stuff that we're talking about, but in a way that doesn't re-traumatize.
Mm-hmm. Just want to call up, we've got some background noise happening, so if you could just be careful about that, either put yourself on mute when you're not speaking, or just be careful, you may not realize the noise you're making. Other folks, though, with reflections or thoughts about this and using these questions in coaching or consultation? Maybe, does anybody have a story of something you've been doing in using these questions in coaching or consultation that you think is might be good learning for other folks on the call?
This is Andrea. I've been using the preferred future questions in mappings with families and asking the parents and the children the questions before asking the social worker. And I don't know that this would be learning for anybody. I'm sure everybody's already doing that. But I have found that it's been really, really productive. And I think when I'm only a year into SOP. I'm not a scholar of this stuff. But I think when I initially went through SOP, I felt like the family's goals weren't quite as important as the agency's goals. And I'm really living the reverse thought. Really feeling like grabbing those families, sort of their goals, their ideas, what they want, has been really helpful as a frame to then say what the agency's goals are, sort of the bottom line. But then in the planning, going back to what the family wants, I don't see any harm in working in things that they want that may not have to do with bottom line safety if they're related. It just seems like it's really been engaging with the family, especially if, we're really listening to what they're saying and charting that just as much. So I've just felt like it's been really helpful.
Yeah. Andrea, do you have a quick story you'd want to share about asking one of those questions in a family meeting? And it's okay if you want to pass.
Sure. I actually had one just a couple of weeks ago. I had a youth, she's a dependent mother, and her child is not in care. She's taking care of her baby, but a referral came in on the baby, and a referral came in by the public health nurse. So we had a family team meeting with lots of formal and informal supports. And, what are we worried about and what's working well was sort of exhaustive. And so we took a break and came back, and I just started with asking her the miracle question or preferred future question. And, her mind was on completing school and having everybody get off her back and, just being a proud mom. And she just sort of described herself as this really successful mom. And it really moved the room. It really, really did. So I wouldn't say that her answer was exactly tied to our agency's bottom line to close out that referral, but just hearing her heart and hearing her describe who she wanted to be, it helped everybody in the room sort of get into their roles about how they could help that young girl get into that new mom that she wanted to be. So it was impactful for the room. And I just think it changed the tone. We were still, obviously we were still concerned about safety, but she just was able to share more about who she wanted to be, and I think that was impactful.
And so can I ask you, irony aside, if she was on the call with us today, and we could ask her what kind of difference it made to her to be able to share her preferred future, her goals for herself with the room, before maybe or alongside a conversation about some bottom line safety, what do you think she'd say? What kind of difference do you have a sense that made for her?
I think she would say that she was finally able to really talk and be heard, and we were able to kind of stand down so that she could put her agenda forward. I don't know that she would use those words, but I think she would say, it's about time you guys listen to me. This is what I want. And she was, a good advocate for herself in that moment. So, yeah.
Thanks, Andrea.
But I think it goes back, I'm so sorry, I'm almost done. I think it goes back to your original point about that trauma lens, which I felt like this today has been such a great module for me. I've learned so much. But maybe in that moment, too, this may be not what she would say, but another observation, as she was saying, this is what I want, she was not in that moment being maybe receiving any system trauma from the meeting and from folks talking about her and with her. She was, maybe it was a trauma-free few minutes for her.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, if we think about that idea of like reclaiming personal agency, right?
Yep.
That naming a goal, this is what I want for myself, feeling like that's respected, feeling like people are going to help you get there. That's got to be a big part of reclaiming your personal agency. So, yeah. Thanks, Andrea.
Sure.
Anybody else want to comment on Andrea's experience with this young woman, or just about this idea of like how important and also what ways of using these questions within, the work, the cues, or the integration? Just want to leave any more room for reflections and stuff before we move on essentially to the second half of the module. Okay. So I'm going to jump back to the exception questions, and again, these 5 sections come up. I'm not going to go deep with them, but I'll walk through them, and if we find we run out of time today, we can pick it up at the beginning next time too. So in many ways, the exception question, I think, is like the cornerstone solution-focused question. Can you tell me about a time the problem could have happened, maybe almost happened, but somehow in some way you were able to do something else instead? There's some basic assumptions that really go with this question, right? No problem is absolute in its effects. There's always some history of families resisting the worst effects of the problem. That's what my teacher, Michael White, used to say, and he was making a play on the word resistance because we think of resistance as a bad thing. And he used to say, no problem is absolute in its effect. People are always trying to find some way of resisting the worst effects of the problem, and part of our job is to be attentive to that. Now, in child welfare, part of our job is to be attentive to the impact the problem's having on the child, right? That's this idea I've sometimes said of listening with 2 ears, listening for the impact on the child, listening for people's attempts to resist the problem, right? Turnell and Edwards would have said, there's always some signs of safety. And it comes up here in this module, one of the things I like to talk about, there's always some history of protection, right? Part of our job when we're doing a rigorous balanced assessment is to look for the times the problem could have done what it always does, could have played itself out, the dynamics could have played itself out, but somehow did not, right? Asking exception questions gives us a place to look for safety, strengths, resources, alternative actions. And again, the idea of this is not just about being nice, but if people have been able to do something in the past, they're way more likely to be able to repeat it in the future. You know, I can think of lots and lots of times in my work with families where I think I've got the best idea in the world. Oh, if you only do this, it will be better, right? And there's huge arrogance, I think, often in that. It's not that my ideas aren't useful, perhaps, but to think that I know exactly what needs to happen, what's going to get us to safety, I think, you know, can be a setup for those power struggles that we talked about earlier. And so that's why if I can get there through questions, if I can try to surface what the family already knows about how to keep their kids safe, what things they've taken, even if they weren't fully successful but were starts at it, I think we're going to have a lot more motivation and buy-in. So, yeah, that's really the background for this. How do you begin to use these questions? One kind of phrase, sticky message we've talked about is to listen for the empty spaces, right? And so we've got this visual, and just as a reminder, if you're doing these modules in sequence, you know, people have heard the Cheryl story, and so you can remind them, you know, like remember the basic elements of the Cheryl story, da 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 da. But you know, when we're looking at exception questions, this is what we're really looking for. We're listening for those empty spaces, right? And oftentimes people, like I say, do you remember when we did this before? The fact that she's off her meds, what does that tell us? That she had been on her meds. The fact that she lost her job and fell into poverty, what does that tell us? That she had been on her job, that she had had a job at some point. The fact that she was diagnosed with depression, what does that tell us? That she was working with a treater at some point, right? That we're listening for these pieces. And we're not going to make grand assumptions about them. Okay, because she had a job, because she was once on meds, because she was once in treatment, we're now ready to send the kids home. Absolutely not. But they're part of our assessment. They're part of assessing what she's capable of. They're part of making plans in the future. You know, if we find out who she's been treated for in the past, we can ask her some questions. What worked about that for you? What didn't work about that for you? If we're thinking about treatment in the future, how does that inform what we're looking for going forward? So I like this visual. You can come at it in other ways, you know, but knowing that that history of protection is always there, you know, and many of you have heard me be the over-dramatic piece here, but like if the child is alive, the parents have done something to keep the child safe. And part of our job is to uncover that with the family as a way to build a foundation for going forward. And exception questions are really one of our biggest tools in doing that. Anybody that worked with Insoo, this is her wisdom. You know, she would often say eliciting exceptions takes persistence, that sometimes, you know, people will not go there with you on the first try. And so she used to say, ask it 3 different ways before you give up. You know, so try, you know, was there ever a time that you, you know, that you got somebody to look after your kids, or let's do a different example. Is there ever a time before you lost your temper, you managed to take a step to do something different? Is there ever a time you just even, so they say no. All right, well, what about, is there ever a time, like, you know that moment where you really lose your cool? Is there ever a moment like you caught yourself and did something? Maybe you took a walk. Maybe you banged your head into a wall, but you did something just a little bit different. What did you do, you know? Well, you know, has there ever been a time that you noticed maybe you got angry and you really like let loose, but then you quickly were able to bring it back down? Can you tell me about that? And so like if they say no 3 times, okay, I'm leaving it behind, but I've tried it 3 different ways. The other thing that I would say on this slide, like giving 3 times to ask for exceptions, is I might also say sometimes it's actually really easy to elicit superficial exemptions. So you know, somebody will say, yeah, there's lots of times I've been sober. Yeah, there's lots of times I got somebody to, you know, look after the kids before I got high. That's not the end of the conversation, right? And that's where I think landing the message that this is really about reflection and inviting people into reflection. Yeah, that's fabulous. When was it? What did you do? Who else helped you? And I think we've got a slide that brings this up in some way, but, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, I think can really, I think that's an important message to send to folks that be careful of just stopping at the superficial exception and really use it to dive deeply. What did you do? How did you do it? Who did you do it with? What would it take to try to do that again? How would we know if you're doing it again, et cetera, et cetera?
So I was
go for it, Ryan.
Sorry, it's Ryan again. I think the part when you hit a wall and they don't have an answer and you've done this 3 times even, I think there's something impactful still before, because I think right then you can feel frustrated with them and you just move on. But I think if you can slow down that sense of irritability and be calm, there's 2 things sometimes that I think help move them still. One is just a sense of empathy for the sadness that they don't have that skill set or that experience to draw upon. And sometimes that is a time for us to acknowledge their trauma history or their lack of parenting examples or whatever it is that we're talking about, lack of ability to modulate their temper. But it's also another time to acknowledge the natural consequences of them not having that, and without judgment or a sense of emotional reactivity to it. Okay, we got a lot to work with then. It'll take us a lot longer than we anticipated. Fair enough, And I think sometimes then that helps them have some of those light bulb moments we've seen. So I think that it's a tricky part if we get frustrated, and I think there's still an opportunity to move them there potentially.
Yeah, and I'll often, maybe this is similar, Ryan, I'll often say to folks, maybe we'll come back to this, because sometimes, you don't want to set up a conversational cul-de-sac where people are like, no, I'm not going to tell you an exception, and so I'm going to back out of that power struggle too, and say maybe this is something we'll come back to, or maybe this is something you haven't been able to do, and like you're saying, I like what you're saying, that this is what we're going to be building towards.
And at that point, it leads them into telling you what services they even want, potentially, rather than us having to stay in that power struggle. So I love that chain that you create.
Yeah. Who can you use exception questions with? You can use it with everybody, the child, other relatives, the providers, the primary caregiver, the secondary caregiver. I think you can use exception questions with mandated reporters. Has there ever been a time when something like this hasn't happened? Now, some mandated reporters won't have a clue. How should I know? I'm a cop. I showed up at 2 a.m. But a lot of our reporters will know. A lot of our providers will know. Has there ever been a time the family's been able to respond to a situation like this in the past? These are important assessment questions. I think Raylene and I have spent some time thinking about exception questions and SDM for those of you working in SDM jurisdictions. And so really sorting out, has the family met the criteria of a particular definition? We might ask, has there ever been a time when so-and-so could have happened or didn't? Or, is there an area that's working well in the family? What's happening? Certainly for scoring things like protective capacities or strengths and needs, exception questions are really going to surface quite a lot for SDM. Again, I think the behavioral details that sometimes come from these questions, well, how did you do that? What did you do? When did you do it? Can help move us away from jargon and generalities into that behavioral details. And one of the things, and we're trying to carve this out going forward in California even more clearly, but if you look at the SDM definitions, especially in the safety assessment in particular, almost all of those really fit under the umbrella of impact on the child, so it's not just mental health, but there's pieces around impact in that definition as well. And so, this is a place I actually think the SOP and the SDM are really in tighter alignment, and we can call it out more particularly, I think, going forward. But just to say that this piece about moving towards behavioral details and getting on impact is also going to be able to help you to score your SDM assessments, I think, even more tightly. There's 2 slides here that just have a quick kind of like mini exercise. It's not putting anybody into pairs or anything, but just as a large group. All right, so let's talk about, you get a case like this where a case opens and a child comes into care. The case closes and the child goes home. And the case opens again and the child, returns back into care, okay? So what are the things we need to know about? I'll ask the group, and, why did the case open before? Why is it opening now? What's going on? What's the impact on the child? Yeah, et cetera, et cetera. And if we were asking exception questions, what do we want to know? Well, why was the case closed? What worked well during that time? What do we need to know about that time also? And make the point here, it's not just one or the other, but it is the both. Similar, this is another timeline. Okay, so person is drunk every night for years, then is sober for 4 months, then drunk again for a month, then sober again for 2 weeks. So where would you want to put your curiosity here? We could land all our curiosity on what made them drink every night for years. Okay, I think we should know something about that. We should probably really understand what, if anything, was the trigger, what happened after the 4 months of sobriety that they got drunk again for a month. But would it be important for us to understand, how were they sober for 4 months? How did they do that after being drunk every night for years? They were sober for 4 months. How did they do that? And also, look at this pattern. It's kind of like, and I say this to the group, it kind of fools with you because the lines all seem the same size. But check this out. So drunk every night for years, 4 months sobriety, off the wagon for a month, but then sober again. That's a very quick turnaround, like drunk again for a month after, every night for years. How did they do that? And Ryan's got a message that's going to come through in a second. I like that sticky language of I really want to know what happens at the corners. So this is just a quick way of landing, again, this idea of searching for exceptions. Some examples come up. You said that John's lying. That's the problem. It's been happening all the time. But then last week there was a moment where it didn't happen. He could have lied and he didn't about X. Can you tell me more about that time? You said even though Jack's drinking has been going on for some time, you were still able to hold on to some hope that things could be better. That's not a small thing when people can hold on to some hope. How did you hold on to that hope? What are you hoping for? What's the background for that hope? What have you seen that's giving you some hope? I understand that Linda's been running away a lot. That would be probably better English than what I have up there. I understand that Linda's been running away a lot, and I do want to hear about it. But can I ask you, though, has there ever been a time Linda could have bolted, but somehow managed to stay? I think about this question a lot when I think about working with parents of adolescents, and how many parents can slip into kind of real vast generalizations about their kids, and useful to break down. Just like I was talking about, like we were talking about cues. So just like talking about a worker who's living in a very problem-saturated story, a family that's living in a very problem-saturated story about themselves, about their children, I think it's important to understand the problem, the impact, and then the exception, right? What would be good for me to know about you as a family or as a parent that would be hard for me to see if I was only going to talk about the problem? If you were to believe that this was a problem, what, if anything, would you want to do about it? That's kind of exception going forward in some way question, but it kind of fits within this kind of scope. So this is kind of the end of the first section of the exceptions, and then there's 2 exercises, and this is really to the point we were talking about before that I think, I think it's really important not to solely do this as didactic. I think it's really important to kind of move through the didactic and then give them some experiential. And Ryan and Margie, I think you also made the point, they really enjoy working on their own cases. And so there's a couple ways you can do this here. Let me show you what we've got, and I'll offer you a third alternative. So we've got 2 exercises here. This puts people into pairs. Person A, I want you to pick a goal in your life that's important to you, something that would make you feel like a better person, but I want you to pick a goal that's comfortable enough to share in a training context. A lot of you have heard me say, we call these the Goldilocks instructions. Don't pick something that's so revealing about yourself you're going to feel uncomfortable. Don't pick something that's so meaningless it's not going to matter, but pick something you feel comfortable sharing to a colleague in a training setting. Okay, pick a goal. Person B, ask your partner an exception question about that goal. Then switch and give feedback. Okay. And in this first one, I might ask the group to debrief this as a large group right here. Okay, what was this like, et cetera, et cetera. And I have to say, I like having people work off something a little bit personal, like not deep, but I think it kind of brings it home a little bit. Some folks are uncomfortable with that. You can kind of try to get the temperature of your room a little bit. The second example asks them to work off Cheryl's case. Okay, and what you want to do is make sure when you showed that example that I went through earlier, you remind them, because it might have been a couple months since they've seen the Cheryl example. So remember we talked about Cheryl, she turned on the gas, yada, yada, yada. Okay, so now I want you to do the same example with Cheryl's case. You guys have two choices. I would give them two choices. You can do it as a role play if you're willing. One of you be Cheryl, one of you be the social worker, ask an exception question related to Cheryl, or if that's going to bug you to death, just come up with 3 to 5 questions, exception questions, that you could ask Cheryl. Okay? Just kind of get in your pairs and come up with them. So that's kind of two examples. I think the third here, if you want to, is you could ask them to work off of a case, to work off their own example, to share it, and have the other person come up with exception questions. The thing about moving to a case in pairs, right, is if you do the Cheryl piece and you ask the group to come up with questions, or if they do it as a role play and they come up with exception questions for Cheryl, you can collect them. You can say, what questions did this pair come up with? What questions did this pair come up with? And the whole group, because they're working off the same case, can hear it, and there can be some kind of course correction. Well, why do we think this question might have landed better than this question? And in fact, in some cases, just so you know, when I've had enough time, I've either written these down, like the questions they come up with, on white paper or a whiteboard, or if I'm really feeling the technology love, I escape out of the PowerPoint, I put in an empty slide, and I type their questions in as they're saying them, so everybody can see the questions up on the screen that people came up with. And I think it's interesting, like small little nuances can be powerful. And also sometimes like people are just playing with this for the first time, they don't really get it. So someone might say, has there ever been a time you weren't depressed? Well, okay. That's not a horrible question. Somebody else might have has there ever been a time you were depressed and you reached out for help? Huh. What do we think is the difference between that and that? Somebody else might have, has there ever been a time you were depressed and reached out for help to make sure the girls were safe? Wow, look at that. So you can kind of walk people through it. So I think it's valuable, at least for one of these exercises, to be the Cheryl one, but maybe I guess something you think about is you could do the Cheryl one first, and then instead of this kind of personal one, you could do a case instead. So something for you to think about. Then there's a summary of exception questions, and that's the first section. So I want to just pause here and see if people have questions or comments about exception questions, or just anything that you're thinking about with the exception questions, thoughts about how you're using these in coaching, or how you might use them in this module, or just anything at all related to this section. Okay. The scaling questions section that comes up next, again, a larger group of slides, shorter than the exception questions, larger than the next 3, but scaling questions here. Oh, I thought I heard some feedback for a second, but it's gone. Scaling questions, one of the things I like to tell people is, I don't know about the Bo Derek there. I'm not going to take responsibility for that. I'm not sure where that slipped in.
That so dates you. I'm sorry.
It so does, but I really can't. I'm not going to throw anybody under the bus, but I'll just say I didn't put Bo Derek there. If you're comfortable with Bo Derek there, feel free to leave it. I'm not sure I would leave Bo there, so I'd encourage you to think about that.
Kim Kardashian, maybe?
Perhaps you could put people there at 10 that would be of multiple genders and cultures, and I'll leave it to your best discretion. Yeah, I'm not super comfortable with that. I haven't seen that there. Yeah. Two things I say about scaling. One is scaling does something I think very subtle that is not always noticed, which is it takes something that is usually a yes-no question and it puts it on a continuum. Yes-no questions have quite a lot of danger to them. We're in a power relationship with the people that we're asking yes-no questions of, and the temptation to either move into a, like, let me figure out what you want me to say, let me figure out what the right answer is very great. And is really it's where I start to use that phrase, a conversational cul-de-sac or a dead end. Do you think that your children were safe last night when you were using meth? It's going to be hard for a parent to say no, and if they do, it's easy to move into a place of a lot of self-attacking and blame and shame about that. So instead of saying, do you think your children were safe last night when you were high on meth? On a scale of 0 to 10, where 10 is your kids were absolutely, totally, 100% safe. Nothing could have happened to them. And 0 is the opposite. Your children were in real serious danger. Where do you think things were last night when you were high on meth? Do you hear like the subtle difference of that? It puts it on a continuum, right? And then, again, many of you will know this. What it really lets us do is to then use this as a launching pad into reflection. It's important for folks to know the number that somebody gives you off of a scale means next to nothing, okay? It's totally subjective. My 8 will be your 7, will be somebody else's 6, and somebody else's 3. So the first number doesn't mean anything. It's a placeholder. It's a metaphor. And it's an invitation for us to have another conversation. How was it that you were able to get it as high as it is? How were you able to keep it as safe as you think it was? What got in the way of it being even higher than that? Can I tell you what my number would have been? I mean, how cool, rather than the county, the worker, the coach to have to take up a position of, well, I don't think it was safe, okay? Like, you can hear the judgment in that. Can I tell you what my number was, right? So I actually think these questions can have incredible subtlety to them, but we have to know how to use them and know how to use the conversation that follows. Trying to advance the slide. So something to think about with scales. Sometimes we call the ends on the scale endpoints, or I call them anchors. In general, with solution-focused work, you want the 0 to be the behavior you're trying to move away from, and 10 the new desired behavior. I find remembering that helpful. If I remember 0 is the thing I'm moving away from, 10 is the thing I'm moving towards, like that sometimes in the midst of a conversation and my pulse is going, I'm getting excited or anxious or whatever, and, it's just useful to remember, there's kind of a general rule here, which is 10's the good thing, 0's the thing we're moving away from. Having said that, it works both ways, and it's not like, you've done it wrong if 0's the thing you're moving towards and 10's the thing you're moving away from. I think just getting the question out is a good place to start. I think it's really important to just help people understand this isn't, even though we'll call it a scaling question, it's really a conversation that follows, right? And some examples of things that can follow. What would your daughter say if she was here? What would her number be? What would it take to move up by 1? Why are you at that number? And I think similarly on this slide, what's helping you get it to that number and not one below? What would need to happen to go up by 1? Can I tell you what I think needs to happen to get my number to go up by 1, right? So this is like a way for a lot of conversations out of that door of the back alley and kind of getting stuck. One thing I say is that, like, the first time you try one of these, it's going to feel a little awkward, but one thing you should know, these are really out there, you know, and some of you have heard me tell my story, which is, you know, after hiking in New Hampshire a couple years ago, I twisted my ankle between 2 rocks and had to go to a physical therapist, and the very first thing I saw on the form where I was doing my intake on physical therapy was a pain scale. Kids are used to this. When they go to a pediatrician, they often get a pain scale that looks something like this, where they've got a happy face on one side and a sad or teary face on the other side. And so this will not be as big a leap for many of the families you're working with as you might think, and it still takes some practice to do. I think I've hit all of these training points already, and so I might not need to go through them all, you know, if I've done it already with the other slides, but you know, I mentioned this before to all of you. I'll just say it again. Things I'm listening for scaling questions when someone's kind of in an all this or all that, like, and so there's no nuance. So the same, whether it's a family or a worker or a team, you know, if people are saying, you know, this is all bad or this is all good, that's where a scale can be really helpful. And when people are really struggling with next steps, small next steps, and this is another place also where people, if people are totally service-driven, you know, if people are really getting stuck describing behaviors, well, I don't know, they just need to go to therapy and get better. Okay, on a scale of 0 to 10, you know, let's talk about what would better look like. What's the 10, which is often our safety goal? What's the behavior we're looking for? What's 0? You know, where are we? That often can be our danger statement. And where are we right now? What would up by 1 look like? So again, really helping people to get very concrete. Who can you use scaling with? Again, you start to see there's a pattern with these slides, and so it's familiar. You can use them with everybody. Scaling in SDM, you know, I think just can be useful for us to try to understand a little bit about, you know, did an event happen, did it not happen? Sometimes that can get us into that back door of yes, no. Starting with a scaling question can get us more information and then lead us into being able to score something, right? So if we just do the yes, no, like one of the contentions we've made, right, is that, you know, with any assessment system, any assessment system at all, it only works based on the information you're able to input into it. So there's that IT phrase, garbage in is garbage out. So whether it's CAT, whether it's SDM, whether it's the CANs, right, whatever it is, if you don't have a good working relationship and you're not getting good information, the assessment system's not going to do what it's designed to do. And so scaling questions that give us that nuance that can really get that behavioral detail are going to let us get further with any of our assessment systems, and in particular SDM. One of the things I want to call out is you can use scaling in all sorts of different ways. You know, Turnell and Edwards in their Signs of Safety book really kind of began to take this into the child welfare lens, and so putting danger and safety on a scale. 0 is the most danger, 10 is the most safety. Where are we? That can be a really useful scale in this work. But an old solution-focused practice would be to scale willingness, confidence, and capacity. And we can also think about progress. And I'll just show you a quick example. So willingness, I don't, and this is what I would say to folks, is I don't like to make plans with folks, case plans, safety plans, without assessing willingness, confidence, and capacity. It's very easy for someone just to yes me to death. Yes, I can do that plan, but I'm not convinced. And so on a scale of 0 to 10, 10 is you're totally willing to do this plan. You're totally excited. 0 is, you know, you're not willing at all. Where are you? So again, this leaves families, parents, adolescents, children, room to have some nuance about this. Well, maybe I'm not so willing, and not to be just in that yes-no place. Capacity is about, do I have everything I need? Okay, so maybe I'm totally willing to take my child to the after-school program. Maybe I'm totally willing to go to a drug treatment program. But do I have what I need to get there? Do I have transportation? Do I have childcare? Do I have whatever? 10 is I have everything I need. 0 is the opposite. Where are you? What would need to happen to bring your rating up by 1? Confidence. 10 is I totally believe I'm going to be able to do this plan. 0 is I actually don't think. I'm willing to do it, but I'm actually not confident I'm going to be able to do it. Okay, why is your confidence level as high as it is? What could happen to bring it up by 1? And the progress scale, right? I think this is really useful for folks who are working with families over long-term work, and ongoing work. We might ask, on a monthly home visit on a scale of 0 to 10, where 10 is you think you've made all the progress you could possibly make between now and the last time I was here, and 0 is the opposite, you made no progress at all. Where do you think things have been over the last month? Can I tell you where I think things are, et cetera, et cetera? Yeah. One thing we say about the scaling questions, a little can go a long way. Some meals may like more salt, some meals less salt. Occasionally, I like to joke, scaling questions I think are the gift that keeps on giving, but you want to be careful you don't overdo it too. And then this section ends with the same 2 exercises that you can do the personal one, which again you could replace with someone's own case, and then you ask to apply it to Cheryl. And then there's a summary of a lot of the points that I've already said here. So can I pause here for just a second? I see a chat coming through, but just questions or comments about the scaling questions?
Well, Phil, this is kind of a more general contextual thing in terms of staying focused, in terms of the work that we're doing here on this call, is related to sort of this module in each one of these segments. The connection to coaching, the connection to, in addition to taking a look at sort of the content of the module, are we thinking about what are the ways in follow-up, not just within the module, but in follow-up that we're getting opportunities to work with our learners around the whole issue of coaching. That's just something I kind of wanted to throw out in terms of the bigger picture here of the webinar.
Yeah, no, I appreciate us being able to walk in both places. Peggy, that's you, right?
Yeah.
Do you have a story or a thought about how you have been either using scaling questions as a part of your work in coaching or have been supporting the learning of scaling questions in coaching? Like what's a story or a thought that you could have that would bridge us into there? Or you can pass, but if you have one, I'd love to hear it.
Well, just I'd have to give some thought to, the context, and I think about scaling questions versus exception questions. I would say that I've had a couple of occasions where I've had beginning learners going out into the field with the intention of practicing some scaling questions, and the whole process of helping to get them ready, and as well as supporting them in the field. In follow-up, because the tendency is they get so kind of scared and awkward about asking the question itself that they forget that the real point of the thing, as you mentioned rightly, is to follow up the answer to that question with another question that gets that family to a better understanding of themselves. So, that's something that I can think of. In terms of a recent story, yesterday I was in the classroom in the Central Valley, and as an aside, we were beginning to talk about strengths-based work and engagement and solution-focused questioning. I had a worker come up to me to talk about some disappointments that she had with a client that she had been kind of on the fence about making recommendations related to reunification services. And she was very focused on all the things she had learned during a break about the mistakes that this mother had made in her progress toward demonstrating some acts of safety. And you mentioned earlier the whole concept of that the question is the intervention. And so I didn't know what the answer was, but I asked the question of her. So in all these things that you've heard about the mom in terms of the mistakes that she's made in the last month, what are the strengths that you see either in the behaviors of the mom or in your interaction with her today? And the light bulb went on with this worker in terms of the fact that it sort of hadn't occurred to her that this mother had accepted responsibility. She had been honest with her about the mistakes she had made, and she'd even offered a solution to how she was going to move forward from there. And the worker just lit up and went, oh. So, I think that you're absolutely right in terms of the work that we do, that it's not about knowing the answers or ending up in a direction. It's about asking the question with genuine curiosity.
Yeah. Yeah, I completely agree. And when you're, my colleague in Boston, John Vogel, likes to say, and I know some of you have heard this riff also, that he doesn't like the phrase parallel process because he says it's not parallel, it's not sort of like, it's not almost like, it's really exactly the same thing. That what we're doing with our staff, what we're trying to do as leaders in this organization, is exactly what we're hoping workers will do with families, in terms of helping them think through their actions and helping them think about a balanced assessment, and so you're asking that question of that worker, I think, gives them a piece of lived experience of what it's been like to be asked that at that moment, and they find value in it. She finds value in it and says, wow, I hadn't thought of that. It's helping me think of all these other things. And that person can take that back into the field with them. So I think it's very powerful, and I can't understate enough how useful I think this is as a practice in our coaching work. So I'd love, though, to hear other people's thoughts or stories about using scaling or exception questions, any of these, in coaching. And yeah.
I'm not sure if I share this, but, I'm working with a large group of workers that are, workers that are working with a large group of Latino families. And so they had a really hard time with scaling questions. And what they were saying is in the, particularly families from Mexico and Guatemala, they don't have like, what's a 10 in your world? And so their parents tend to look at them like this, kind of when they ask these questions. And so their experience is then they ask the questions, the parents don't get it. But then when they come back, they've had parents actually like stop them and say, wait, I got the answer to the question. It's a 4. So they thought about it for 2 weeks. And then I have another worker who was asking too many scaling questions, and the supervisor told him to knock it off and ask something else. And so he went out to see a parent who'd lost his job, and he said, parent, so, I'm sorry you lost your job. How do you feel about that? And the parent actually looked at him and said, about a 5. So it becomes part of the conversation and culture with the family, which has been really interesting to watch.
In a way that the family has experienced positively, you think?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. The family actually, in one of the cases they told me, they asked a scaling question to a couple. And then apparently when they came back, the father said, don't talk, I want to talk first. And he gave him his number because they wanted to hear his wife's number. But they kind of think about it. It's like a way they have sort of learned, like the workers have taught them what scaling questions are, and they become part of the dialogue of the family, and it's a way for the family to articulate how they feel about something. For them to be very successful. They said the first experience was, not great because parents don't get it, but later on it just became part of the dialogue and the way that they measure and talk about things with the family. It's been really interesting to hear about.
Yeah. What that reminds me of, Margie, I'll just say, and then I want to get some other thoughts or stories about the application to coaching, and I think this is probably as far as we're going to go today. We'll finish this module next time. But the before I learned 3 houses or Safety House or stuff, when I was stuck trying to have dialogue with children, adolescents even, scaling questions were sometimes one of my favorite kind of go-to places with kids, because asking them questions, yes, no, or whatever, was often not very successful, but I would draw a scale, a 0 to 10, a 0 to 5 scale, would ask them to draw a picture of what the anchors were. So when things are at the best in your family, what do they look like? We do a picture of that. When things are really, really hard, what does that look like? And try to get some words or some colors or something. And then where are you now? And all the questions that go from there. So and then just I think what made me remember this story was the kids then would, when I'd meet them again, would want to do the scale again right away. It's like it helped provide a language for something that maybe there wasn't a language for. So. Other people's thoughts or reflections about what we've covered so far today, solution focus generally, exception questions and scaling questions, and ways you've used this in your coaching or dilemmas you've encountered trying to use this in your coaching. And then there was silence.
Bill, this is Todd. I just probably reiterating what has already been said, but the biggest difficulty I have is getting people to try it on first, making it small enough and having them motivated enough. And probably, I think the key to that is in part having their supervisors mirror that type of behavior in supervision. Also that they have some feedback to it once they do try it, and maybe from a coach or maybe from a supervisor or hopefully the family themselves. So I just, in terms of those two things, seem to be the biggest roadblocks for me.
Yeah. I'd love to hear other people's thoughts about that, but I really actually think that's a nice recipe, Todd. Like if you think about, like it needs to be small, and we talk about this in some of the implementation stuff, but it needs to be small enough to try, and there needs to be a feedback loop where I can really understand, did it make a difference, and is there someone who's going to ask me to be thinking about that? And so I think those are actually two really important ingredients to actually somebody taking something off a slide and putting it into the real world. Is it small enough that I can try so I don't feel overwhelmed? And is there a way I'm going to get feedback about, like, did it land and how did it land? So I appreciate you calling that out. In our last couple minutes here, we're going to do a plus delta, but does anybody else have another thought about ways you've tried to help people try this on, strategies, things you've seen that's been successful? So outside of the scope of a webinar or a training or, the module?
Hi, so it's Veronica. In the particular county I'm in, it's a very small jurisdiction, and in terms of coaching in the context of a family team meeting, their facilitator asks for family's permission for me to be there. I introduce myself. One has to give permission for me to be in the room. And, I asked the facilitator what role would they like me to serve. And what she's asked me to do is when she gets stuck, sort of like what Heather has called a coach angel in the meeting. And when she gets stuck, usually what I do is at that moment in the meeting is pose a scaling question or a solution-focused type question to help move the group forward. And one meeting that she was facilitating, it was actually pretty interesting. It was 3 very boisterous, amped-up teenage girls who were placed in a foster home. And because it's a small town, the foster parents end up knowing the biological parent, and the biological parents actually were having a lot of input in how the foster home was running. And they often are very attacking towards the foster parent, like, why aren't you doing this? Or why aren't you making sure girls have this? Or why don't you have enough rules in your house? And it was at that point of spending lots of time on the worries and helping that facilitator get through what the worries are, and just using some questions of, what are you most worried about? And asking questions, if I were to put this in one statement on a scale of 0 to 10, tell me where do you think this falls in terms of what you're worried about. And when it came
down to is that the biological parents really wanted the girls to be able to stay in that placement with that foster parent because they knew there would be no other place that would take 3 teenage girls. And once that became clear, and the use of squelling questions around the room, and when we formed, pretty much the danger statement and asked everyone where would that danger statement fall on a scale of 0 to 10, everyone's like, that's it. That's what we're all worried about. We don't want to leave this placement. We want to be here. We want to stay together as a family. It was really helpful, and it was sort of in-the-moment type coaching for that facilitator who now uses questions and scaling questions and position questions throughout her meetings. And as we debriefed it with the family and asked the family, what they thought about the meeting, it was really cute. The teenage girl says, "We like that question, lady." So it was helpful. That was my only role. I only asked questions. That's all I did.
I love thinking about the question lady of California. That's fabulous. Do you want to say, there's a lot I could ask you, Veronica, but I guess I'm curious, just maybe as a way of us coming to an end, was there, or pause really for today in this material, was there, what's helping you to kind of come up with the questions and to be the question lady at that moment? Like what have you had to do to get comfortable in that role? Like, what's one thing you'd want other people to know about that?
Well, I think it's a lot easier to do that as an observer because I could see where the facilitator was getting stuck and see her attempts to try to move the group. And I think it's easier to do that when you're observing rather than being a participant, part of the content. I think it's helping me to do that. Just stepping out and trying and knowing that the family doesn't know what this is, and if I make a mistake, just try rewording it or saying it another way. And after the first squelling questions, one of the teenage girls said, I'm not sure. What are you trying to ask me? And then breaking it down for her. But after a while, she got the hang of it, and she would say, I'm a 10. I know you're going to ask me. I'm a 10, You sort of have to get the group used to that as how we break that information. And it also just took the emotion and the heightened, the conflict, where it just moved people to a place in their brain and their presence of just thinking more critically about information rather than being much more reactive.
Yeah. That's been my experience also, so that's great to hear. Thanks for telling us that. We're coming up on our time, and so I'd love to do a plus delta as we wrap up today. We did not get to finish this module, which will be a little bit of a delta for me. But whether it's me or Heather that does the next one, we'll make sure we start by finishing this material. But just love to hear some feedback about today, all with the eye of doing what's working well and capitalizing it, and also making sure that the future calls we make work at their best. So I'd love to hear some feedback about today, what worked well for you, and what could we have done better, and what could we do better for next time.
This is Peggy. I have, I guess, both a plus and a delta, or just a thinking about follow-up call. In terms of today, I think that it's, I'm somebody who participated in the mini module T for Ts, and as a result of that, I have sort of walked through these modules with you in a T for T kind of format. And I know that it's always a benefit to take a look at the updates and as well as make sure everybody's on the same page with, how the module flows. And in thinking about this call, it would really be helpful to me to spend some time kind of more interactively during the process to dive into the skill building pieces, to perhaps, as you did, facilitate discussion of the module use, but in particular really focus in on that connectivity to the practical coaching piece, sort of interactively during that review process of the modules. Do I making sense?
Totally. Yep. No, and I think we've been able to do that in the past, and I'm not sure we really got there. Like our balance today felt a little bit off to me too. I think we got there in small pieces, and you helped us to get there at the end, but it didn't feel as balanced as the time I know I was with you for the first module, which to me felt much more balanced. So I'm not quite sure what happened about that, but maybe we can make that more explicitly an agreement we're trying to do up front about how we're going to kind of share that and build our joint repertoire about that. But no, I would totally agree with you, Peggy. Other folks? Thank you. And I'm not sure, was that your Delta and your Plus, Peggy?
Yes, it was.
Yeah, thanks. Other folks would agree with Peggy, or different ideas, pluses or deltas for today?
That's Ryan. I don't know if this is a plus or a delta, maybe just a hope for the future. I hope for more of an interchange of ideas, because there's a lot of people in our group and a lot of experience levels. But I think there's a number of people who've actually trained the modules that we're going over. And I'd love to hear kind of like where it got hard, how they pushed through it. If people have a difference of opinion on what I'm kind of putting out there, I'm always kind of real curious to hear that part. So wondering what can help improve that next time.
Yeah. Yeah, again, I don't know if you would agree. I think we've, and you being everybody, I think we've had a little bit more of that conversation in the past, and I'm not sure what got in the way of it happening today. So maybe that's something that we can think about going into next time.
I agree. I love the dialogue about the practical pieces when you give examples and you give this 3 questions and you walk through I can hear you just writing down all your questions. But like Peggy, I've been to the curriculum before, so the curriculum's less helpful for me, but the dialogue's more helpful. This curriculum's also really dense and packed, so it lends itself, that's why maybe it needs to be 2 days, even with coaching and all that in the training, but that's my plus and my delta.
Thanks, Margie. Anybody else? I know we're past our time, so we're going to wrap up, but just anybody else with a burning plus or a burning delta? All right. I want to thank everybody for being on the call today. I appreciate the feedback. We'll endeavor to watch our balance on kind of the review of the curriculum and the dialogue that takes place and think about what ways I can facilitate that happening a little bit more and that we can set that expectation jointly when we get started. I hope everybody had a great New Year. It was great to hear a lot of your voices on the call today, and I look forward to catching up with you again sometime soon. My understanding, our next call is going to be February 22nd, and that's going to be instead of the on-site day. There'll be reminders about that, I'm sure, through the email, and I'll be following up with Judith and with Jennifer about that, with Judy and Jennifer. So thanks, everybody, and I wish you well.
Thank you.
Thanks, Phil.